Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this morning's Kaipara District Council briefing for the upcoming district plan and our district plan review. Of course, also this morning this is the first day of level 2 lockdown, so Northland is now basically an island separated from the rest of New Zealand by Auckland, which is at level 4. These are extraordinary times, and Kaipara District Council is using the very best digital technologies to bring this briefing to you today about the very important item of the Kaipara District Plan Review. So I'm going to open this morning's briefing with a karakia. Kia hora te marino, kia whakapapu poinamu te moana, hei hoa rahi mā tātou I te rangi nei, aroha atu, aroha mai, tātou I a tātou katoa. So it's great to be able to be joining you from, like I say, from level 2 here. And at this point, I'm going to hand over to Michael Day, who is leading the district plan review for our council, who is going to lead us through this work today. Michael, kia ora.
Kia ora. Thank you, Mayor Smith. So we have a presentation that my colleague Catherine Overwater will put up on the screen shortly, and we'll work through that. Thank you, Catherine. While Catherine's getting the presentation ready, I'll just start by saying that we'll take the paper as read. And so thank you, Catherine. So yes, we are at our district plan review briefing. Next slide, please, Catherine. So the team is really excited. This is the first briefing for our draft district plan. What we're going to do today is actually introduce the first 2 topics in the district plan review. That's the strategic direction chapter, as well as the tangata whenua chapter. Also speak to the timetable for drafting the district plan, and also talk to some principles about plan drafting as we move into this next phase of the district plan review. From a staff perspective, we are really keen for this session to be as interactive as possible, and we would like you guys to ask as many questions as you can. We will try and answer those questions, and we understand that it's challenging whilst everyone is at home, but we'll try and make this as interactive as possible. Thank you, Catherine. Next slide. Oh, Mayor.
Yes, Michael, I'll just come in there. So if everyone who's participating here in the meeting could please open the chat function, open the little chat box on the side of your screen. While it will reduce the size of the presentation, it will also allow for everyone to see any questions that people have, and then we're asking the presenters to read those questions and respond so that they don't have to drop out of the visual presentation in order to get questions, so that we can keep this rolling. Yeah, so if everyone can just open the chat function, that would be good. Thank you. Sorry, Michael, carrying on.
Sorry, can I just need to drop out of the presentation and come back with my chat box open, because it's gone. So I need to be able to see it while presenting. So just give me 2 secs.
Thank you. And just before we carry on, the presentations today from a staff perspective will be led by myself, Catherine Overwater, who's our Senior Resource Management Planner, and then Paul Vanders as well, our District Planner. And we'll play a bit of tag throughout the presentations as well, and be supporting each other as well as we go through. Next slide, please, Catherine. Right, so the process for getting through our district plan review. So we are at September 2021, we are just entering phase 2. Now, this process can be viewed as an iterative 3-phase process, starting off with issues and options / discussion documents, which the team have produced and are actually consulting on right now. Phase 2 is the drafting, which we're going to start now and then hopefully be producing a draft district plan around April/May next year, 2022. And then phase 3 will lead up to notification of the new district plan, hopefully in September next year. So it's a very ambitious timetable, but we are fully committed to working this through and looking forward to this work in front of us. Next slide, please, Catherine. Okay, so just a couple of slides now on the actual timetable for preparing the draft over the next few months. So what we have here is, as I've just touched on, our first 2 topics that we're going to walk through today is the strategic direction and the tangata whenua provisions. We've specifically chosen to start with these 2 as they don't have any actual rules as well, but they're actually useful for actually covering the high level direction. Then next month we'll start stepping into the rules. We'll go through the general district wide matters, natural environment values as well, and then November talk about subdivision, urban zoning, rural zoning in December, as well as hazards and risk. Next slide, please, Catherine. February, we are keen to actually revisit the strategic direction chapter as well as the tangata whenua processes too, because we think it will actually be quite useful once we work through our urban zoning and rural zoning work, as well as our natural hazard work to come back to the strategic direction and the tangata whenua processes too. We really want to get more feedback from our mana whenua partners prior to actually putting this forward more. And March will be natural environment values part 2, energy infrastructure and transport, and then April being the full draft district plan back. So there we go there. Any questions so far? No. Next slide then, please, Catherine. Okay, next one. So we think it's quite useful as we embark on this next phase of the district plan review to actually just touch on some key principles for drafting a new district plan. And look, I'm not going to really talk to this slide here that much, apart from it kind of touches on what we expect from our new district plan. And first and foremost, we're after a district plan that is special to Kaipara, that's actually unique for us, which gives effect to all the national level direction, such as the national policy statements, regional policy statement, and also implements our spatial plans as well, because as everyone knows, Kaipara has produced some wonderful spatial plans recently, and the district plan is the actual chance to actually implement those through the formal planning process. Any questions so far? No? Oh, one, yes. Yes, Smith.
So, Michael, just regarding the timetable of what any national policy statements, the regional direction, the regional policy statements and so on that absolutely have impact, and sorry, and this is in the papers for later, but the timetable of some of those things, if we go back to your couple of slides ago, you had an indication of some of those pieces. It's a moving feast, if you like, regarding the changes in when bits of legislation or national policy statements are coming. How do we best adapt and put a stick in the ground regarding our district plan in this environment?
It's a really good question. And unfortunately, we don't have any control over what central government promulgates with regards to national policy statements, national environmental standards, and or the actual RMA reform process as well, for that matter. Saying that though, we have to incorporate anything that actually comes out prior to notification of our new district plan. So our line in the sand, for that matter, is actually when the new plan is notified in September next year, and any national policy statements or national environmental standards which are produced prior to notification will need to be incorporated where relevant into our district planning framework as well.
Okay, thank you. That's clear. So for clarity, that's perfectly clear. So what the key is, we could do a whole piece of work in a subject area here, and then in August next year there could be a new national policy statement revealed on that subject in which we've done this work, which then would change the direction of our work. It is possible.
Potentially, but as staff, we are cognizant of the Ministry for the Environment's Forward Work Programme, and we know what national policy statements that they're actually promulgating at the moment. So we don't anticipate any just coming out of the blue as well.
Okay, thank you. And there's also a question here from Deputy Mayor Curnow.
What's that question?
I've put it in the chat, just whether there's any indication sort of in your report that you sent out to us, there was a suggested sort of format for the new district plan. And I'm just wondering whether there's any indication that that's going to be likely to be similar to what comes out of the RMA reforms. Is there any hint on that?
There are no. Short answer, no, Deputy Mayor. We are yet to see any actual substantial detail of what the new planning framework will look like. I suppose a key point I'd like to make is that we would like to future-proof our new district plan so that and it'll be as up to date as possible, so it can be uplifted into any new future planning regime.
I guess
that
was the answer I was hoping to hear, that we're getting as close as we can to what we see as the direction.
Yes.
I hope that there's as little as possible needed in terms of rejigging the whole thing, as opposed to just manipulating it into that format. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any further questions before we move on? Okay, next slide then, please, Catherine.
I was waving my hand around.
Oh, sorry, I didn't.
It's a kind of question. So just for clarification, in terms of this process, because hopefully the national planning standards will remain following the RMA reform. So that's, I guess, a sort of question there. Would that be a reasonable assumption?
That's expected, yes. Yes.
The other thing is we get across the line with our notification of the proposed district plan next year, and in terms of the intended approach of the RMA reforms, where it basically be a regional approach, then there'd be in effect an aggregation of plans. I would assume, and I'm just checking in with you, a reasonable assumption would be that to be a transitional period leading to actual unification, where it would be a transitional plan, and there'll be the Kaipara part, the Far North part, and the Whangarei part, and the NRC part, I guess. So is that the way it's likely to go?
That's a really good question, Councillor Vincent. And whilst we don't have that level of detail yet, what we have been told through Ministry for the Environment staff is that we should expect there to be somewhere between a 5 and 10 year transitional period once the new legislation is actually developed and brought into effect, hopefully by the end of next year. But of course, we can't control their processes either, and it could well slip. But the short answer is that there'll be many years in this transitional period as we actually go between the RMA and any new future legislation as well.
Yeah, I guess I was just drawing upon my experience back to 1989, actually. Yeah, so it's, yeah, that would be the practical approach I would have thought. So what it means is, for me, is that it is worth our while to go hard with this as much as we can, because it will last, dare I say, at least for the life of the Kaipara district.
Thank you, and I'd like to remind councillors to raise their hand with the official reaction raised hand button, and or put their questions in the open chat line rather than just waving at the screen, if that's possible. Thank you. And also, Councillor Vincent, some of us were still at school in 1989. Yeah. Anyway, Michael Day, carrying on. Yeah, thank you.
I was at school then, yes. With regards to feedback into the draft provisions, what we're proposing is a similar process which we ran with the discussion documents, in that we are seeking a 2-week feedback period following each draft workshop / briefing, and that will enable staff to actually collate any comments and feedbacks, and then actually start feeding that into our next drafting. Saying that, we are keen on feedback on a day like this, and we will also be seeking to actually get the material to you hopefully a week prior to the actual briefings as well, and which will give you time to actually read through the material and then come and provide feedback as well. A key point is that this process is iterative, and some topics we will be bringing back as we have more information. You'll see that the material that you have in front of you today is a working draft. From a staff perspective, we are really clear to try and demonstrate that it's not a finished product yet, and we are after feedback. Similarly, we'll have a feedback process where we'll be sharing this with our internal colleagues as well, such as our consents team as well, and our infrastructure planning team as an example as well. The Section 32 reports will not be available until closer to formal public notification, and that's because there's a lot more work inside them. So as an example, a chapter of a new district plan might be 10 to 20 pages, yet the Section 32 report behind it might be 100 pages just for one chapter, as an example. And so staff won't have that material ready prior to preparing the draft, but we do intend to actually bring issues and options material along for each briefing so that we can actually have a robust discussion and seek as much direction as possible each briefing as well. Any questions there? I see 2.
Yeah, so Michael, I just refer you to Deputy Mayor Curno's question here that's in the written feedback in the chat function. Thank you. It's regarding feedback that conflicts with other feedback.
How will you handle feedback that conflicts with other feedback? Could you clarify what you mean, please, Deputy Mayor?
If you're giving us as elected members 2 weeks to provide you feedback, how will you handle, because we're not in the room together, if I give you a particular feedback and then another elected member says something which conflicts with that, so you end up with 2 different points of view coming from elected members, because we're not in the same environment, room or virtual room, we're not able to sort of nut that out between each other before we give it to you. So you'll be getting conflicting views potentially, hopefully not, but the potential is for us to give conflicting views to you in this approach.
Hopefully, come next briefing, we'll all be face to face again in October. But fingers crossed. But that's a good question. And look, it's up to us as staff to actually work through any feedback which elected members give us, and actually come to which we initially think are is the most appropriate position, and then we'll take it back to the whole team after that. There is a chance that some feedback might be conflicting, but we just have to work through it. It's just a part of the process.
So if what I'm hearing is that you'll take those different points of view, work them through, and if there is a logical place to land with it, then that's where you'll land. Otherwise, you might bring it back to us and say, well, there's two strongly differing views here. Which is it as a group you want to check.
And yes, as the short answer is yes, and I suppose a key point to make as well is this is just preparing the material for the draft plan, which is in effect a non-statutory plan as well. So one of our philosophies is we're actually looking to involve as much have as many opportunities for the public as well as elected members to help shape this new plan, which is why we're doing an initiatives and options round, then a draft round prior to public notification as well.
Okay, all right.
Any further questions? Nope. All right, we'll keep rolling then. Catherine, next slide, please. Okay, so I'm sure everyone's aware of this, so I won't dwell too much on this. This just basically talks to the point that there is a hierarchy that we need to follow when we are preparing district plans, starting with the RMA as the overriding piece of legislation which we're currently working with. Then we have to actually have our national planning standard template, which the new plan will be in. National policy statements underneath that, which district plans are required to give effect to. Similarly, national environmental standards where applicable. The regional policy statement for Northland, our new district plan will be required to give effect to the RPS, and then the regional plan for Northland as well. Our work must not be inconsistent with provisions in the regional plan for Northland. So that's the kind of hierarchy that our new district plan is prepared under. Next slide, please, Catherine. Like I said, I won't dwell on this point because it's quite well known. So I've probably talked enough for now. I'll probably pass it over to Catherine to talk to a few slides, if that's okay.
Well, thanks, Mike. Do you want me to just run through the legal hierarchy, or you feel like you've kind of covered that, or do you want me to get into the detail of the terminology here and just give an overview?
I think it would be good to have that overview, Catherine. Thank you. Again, the hierarchy of these terminologies, because it is
Perfect.
important. Thank you.
Perfect. So for those that are familiar with RMA terms, you will have heard these terms: give effect to, recognise and provide for, have particular regard to, take into account. So those are all have particular meaning for what we do, and as Mike's just kind of covered in brief there, in relation to the different documents that we have to look up to when we do our policy drafting. Probably the key one there is the give effect to. So that's really that we don't have much of a choice to do, and I've put there that it's a positively implement, so strong directive. There's not really too many ways that we can skirt around provisions that we need to give effect to. So it's kind of, if you can keep it in your mind that when we say we need to give effect to, XYZ national policy statement direction, or NES direction, or even regional plan direction, that's pretty much a, council must do this. So that's probably the most important one to bear in mind. Recognise and provide for. So this again has quite strong terminology for us as planners. So we have to give it priority, and I've just made a note there that it has significant priority, which requires KDC to make provision more onerous than take into account, which is obviously a little bit further down the hierarchy there. So this is one that we do need to also give quite a lot of consideration to our provisions where we're being told to recognise and provide for from those legal documents or hierarchy. Have particular regard to. Again, we have to turn our minds to anything that suggests that we have to have particular regard to. So this is a test for us to have considered, and I've put there must give weight to and creates a duty to be on inquiry, needs to be carefully weighed in coming to a conclusion. So for me as a planner, when I'm making a decision about whether a provision needs to have particular regard to, I need to turn my mind to that. So you'll probably hear me talking about having particular regard to something, and really it's not as mandatory as the two higher terminologies we've just talked about, but it means that I need to have considered it and weighed it in my decision making, which obviously you'll be part of there. Take into account is probably the lower one on the scale, but certainly we need to factor this into our decision making as well. So this is, again, turning our mind and considering it and weighing it up with other relevant factors. So hopefully that just sets the scene in terms of what we need to do as planners. And there's a whole bunch of case law if you're really interested in understanding these terms more. I think this just gives you a bit of an overview of what we need to do in terms of plan drafting. So hopefully that sets some scenes for what I'm going to talk about next with you. Any questions on that before I move on?
Pretty clear. Thanks, Catherine.
Thanks, Mike. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about writing objectives. And I don't know if anybody's had the privilege of writing objectives before, but these are pretty key for writing a district plan, and it certainly sets the direction for what we want to achieve from our district plan. So the Resource Management Act does give us quite a lot of clues as to what we need to sort of start with. But certainly, and we'll talk through obviously the strategic objectives today and those objectives specifically relating to the Tangata Whenua chapter. These are really important though, because when you're in a hearing situation, as some of our trained commissioners will know, this is the bit that can determine whether an application meets the intentions of the district plan or doesn't. And so when we're drafting these, we need to be really clear and specific about what it is that we want for Kaipara District. And so hopefully when we're going through these sessions with you, you'll be thinking about, what it is that we want to get from our district plan. And with good drafting, we should get there. So we're hoping that we can do a good job in that space for you. So basically, yeah, these should be really specific and describe the outcome that we need to seek or achieve. They need to be accessible and measurable. So when I say that, there's no point writing an objective that nobody can understand or assess or measure things against. So, it's all well and good having an objective that, says that all properties within the Kaipara need to be beautiful and amazing. When there's no real way of measuring that, we need them to be really clear about what it is we want to get from them. So this is where we should use positive wording, unless the outcome is to avoid or prevent. And so you'll hear us talk about avoid and prevent when there's something that we want specifically to achieve from that. I've made a note there that they need to be written succinctly and in plain English. And I know many of you will agree that they need to just be clear. Like, we don't want to be in a place where we have to interpret our own district plan constantly. So the plan really needs to do a good job of that. And it also should not repeat a higher level objectives. So I'll talk to you a bit more about the cascade as we move from objectives to policies to rules, but we shouldn't be repetitive in our plan. So I've just put a few points there about objectives should avoid being short and meaningless objectives or statements, repeating provisions in the RMA. You'll see it a lot where the terminology, avoid significant effects on blah 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 as it's worded in the RMA. And while it's fine, old plans do that a lot, but in the new age, we're trying really hard to be a lot more clear and succinct in our meanings there. So we try and avoid doing that. And then the use of vague language is probably quite clear. So things like as far as practicable, that's quite a meaningless objective for people that are trying to implement something quite specific, or when you're looking at a particular resource consent application. And then setting standards or state how the objective is to be achieved. So these should follow through into the rules and the policies. So I'll talk you through the next step of the cascade, which is policies. But I just probably want to make the point here that, while the district plan doesn't include or won't include issue statements like our current plan does at the moment, it's always a good place to start with identifying what the issue is. So then you can draft a clear and articulate objective based on what that issue is that you're trying to achieve good outcomes for. So we'll talk about some issues today, but just they won't go into the plan, but it's really helpful if we can start with what is the issue and then formulate our objective around that. So any questions before I move on to the policies? I can see a hand up. Yep.
My question is about the objectives and parallel to that outcomes. So the Natural and Built Environment Act is going to require in regional plans direct outcomes rather than objectives, or as well as objectives. So what have you got to say about that? Is this work going to be able to work in with the Natural Built Environments Act, or is this going to have to be undone?
Okay, so I think to respond to the first part of your question there, which was about regional policy statements, regional plans? So if there's specific outcomes that those plans require us as territorial authorities or local government to implement, then we will need to obviously see what that direction is saying. And if it's a mandatory direction, as I said earlier, with the give effect to, then it needs to go into our plan. So you'll just see it cascade from the regional plan into our plan. In terms of the Natural Built Environment Act, sorry, Councillor De Oliveira, I'm just a bit unclear what you mean there in terms of, like, we don't know what's coming from that piece of legislation at this point yet. So we've only had a little clue as far as the exposure draft, but do you want to elaborate on that question just a little bit more so I can helpfully answer that?
Yes, I'm elaborate from the clear direction from the Randerson report that it's, outcomes are to be set out in a combined plan, and they will be, and how they will be delivered in a region. So it seems very clear that that is what is coming, and obviously I don't know, but
if I could answer that question, as Catherine said, that clarity isn't there yet, and it could be that those outcomes come directly from a suite of national policy statements which are yet to be promulgated, or it could be up to each individual regional plan to try and articulate what those outcomes are, but it's just unclear yet is the short answer, so we don't know.
So
the crystal ball there, and we can't gaze into that crystal ball because the central government hasn't even developed that legislation yet. So we don't know what the answer is, but as I touched on earlier on, our intention is to future-proof our new plan so that it can be slotted into any future planning system anyway.
But how can you be certain of that? I mean, if you don't have a crystal ball, how can you future-proof all the work you're doing if it has to be entirely undone?
Well, no one's...
Or mostly undone, or partially undone. It's. Can I just ask, our peer councils, are they also reviewing their district plan, or are they giving pause to this rather than having to potentially redo a whole lot of work at cost to the ratepayer?
So Far North, they are in a similar process to us. In fact, they're slightly in front of us, and their intention is to notify their new district plan towards the end of this year. And Whangarei District Council is in a rolling review, and so they are constantly putting out plan changes. And so no council across the country has an intention of pausing work, and the direction from Ministry for the Environment to all council currently is to not pause any planning work and to keep on moving.
But we're not pausing it, we're just about to embark on it. So you've pointed out that the other councils, our peer councils, have come a lot way more forward before the government signalled that the planning legislation is going to be completely undone. And so, you know, why are we so advancing what seems to me in haste when within 5 years or 3 years, you know, this is going to be a whole new planning framework that we're going to have to redo a district plan to fit in with, potentially.
Yeah, I think if I can just add in there that the timeframes that MFE are talking about at the moment are probably the life of our next district plan, Councillor De Vries. So if that is the case, what we're doing at the moment is not being cognizant of what changes are coming, because obviously Mike and Paul and I have been keeping abreast of those changes in the NBA. We've raised a lot of questions and obviously through our council submission about what some of those outcomes look like. But we are, where we can and we know it's sensible, and I'll talk more to this in the Tangata Whenua chapter because there's some good guidance in the new NBA about certain things. But I think where we can pick up, knowing what that direction is going to look like, we will. But I think for the time being, we just need to park the thought of this piece of legislation that we don't know what it looks like, and we don't know what's going to be in that bill when it comes into Parliament at the end of the year. So I think we've done a pretty good job trying to keep elected members abreast of these changes, and will continue to do so as we know things. But just, yeah, I think just know that there's change coming, and that we are doing our best to make sure our plan is the best plan that we can provide at this point in time, knowing that it could be a 10-year transition period until the NBA replaces our current district plan. So we want to make sure that we've got a fit for purpose plan, and that would be my guidance to you as elected members, to bear that in mind as we roll through this district plan. And I don't think that anything we're presenting to you is going to conflict with where we're heading, because these are all issues that are, you know, front of mind for every council at the moment.
If I can add something, and that is the experience that we had in the past. The old Town and Country Planning Act was an activity-based planning. The Resource Management Act was a effects-based planning, and we are moving towards outcome-based planning in the future. We have already started with parts of the outcome-based with our spatial plans, which is outcome-based. And in many cases, we are using the outcome-based to actually shape our present plan, which is still an effects-based plan. So I think that by having done the spatial plans, it is already forward-looking and taking that into account while we write the objectives, policies, and rules.
Thank you, Paul. Elected members, Councillor De Vries Woodcock and Councillor Curnow, your hands are still up. You still have your hands raised. Councillor Curnow, you actually have a further question here. Thank you.
It's partly a question, partly a comment. Yeah, the need for a district plan review has been in place since many of us were first elected sort of 5 years ago. Our communities are crying out for further clarity around development in our district. So I think that there's a real need there. And my question is, there is a statutory obligation to review a district plan every 10 years, isn't there? So if this one was adopted in 2015, then we're heading towards needing to review it anyway, aren't we?
Yes, definitely. So our plan dates back to 2013, which means that the
Okay.
review would need to be kicking off next year anyway. So we're actually ahead of schedule at the moment, which is a good place to be.
All right. So there would be no statutory case for pausing it at this stage. Given, I mean, we've already got huge community demand for doing something like this, but also there's a statutory requirement on us to be doing this anyway.
That's right. But I think the need of the community is the greater one here. And you might remember I brought a paper to you when I first arrived at KDC about the pressure in terms of private plan changes versus actually doing all our zoning through the district plan. And I think that's a really good example of why we need to push forward to provide and implement what we've already worked through in the spatial plans. The spatial plans set the direction for the district, but unfortunately they don't have the rules to go with that. So this is our vehicle for getting there, and by pushing on and compressing the timeframes, knowing we're competing with these resource management reforms, I think it puts us in good stead for whatever the changes are going to be. And I think we've always used the term that we'll be, you know, flexible and agile in this space to try and do the best we can to leapfrog around what central government are doing here. So yeah, I think there is merit in continuing on this journey for sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, carrying on, please, Catherine.
All right, thank you. So there's only a few points here to talk about policies, but anyone that knows about the district plan at the moment will know that we have objectives, policies and rules. And so the objectives set that higher scene in terms of outcomes. The policies are the more specific ones. So if you can remember anything from today, objectives, which Paul and I will be talking you through because the strategic direction chapter in the Tangata Whenua only have objectives, but there will be a lot of chapters we talk you through where we have policies and then rules. So the policies are the more specific, and so they are really the action. What are we going to do to achieve that objective that you've already talked about, and what, you know, how are we going to achieve that outcome that you've set in your direction? So you'll find a lot of the policies are very much about how we're going to deliver on what we said we're going to achieve. So yeah, basically these also need to be marrying up with the rules. So you don't want to write a policy that then you've got a completely different rule for. So your rules and your policies actually need to align with each other. And if you can think about policy plan making, there's a bit of a waterfall. So the top of the waterfall, you've got your objectives. We cascade down into our policies, and then we have our rules at the bottom, and the rules are obviously the triggers for when a consent is required. I haven't included a slide on rules today because I thought that most people understand what rules are, but I am going to take you through the different levels of activity status that apply to rules. I just had a thought there too. One of the things that we haven't mentioned to elected members is that all of our plan drafting is going to be done in ePlan. So you'll be familiar with ePlan being our online district plan at the moment. And so one of the things that the team are working on in the background is actually putting all of our drafting into ePlan. So instead of having a old-fashioned Word document of the plan, it will all be done in ePlan. And so we'll probably have a session on that once we've got our head around how that's all working, and we're looking to draft our chapters in there. So some of the chapters that you receive will actually be directly out of ePlan. And so that's going to be our tool, which you'll be given access to once we bring the full plan in its draft form back to you. You'll be given some access to that to work through what that looks like. But just to give you a heads up on our ePlan. So this is a part, and Paul, you might like to jump in here because I know you're passionate about activity statuses, but most of you will be familiar with how rules work, and what we are looking for some direction from you as elected members as we work through the various chapters, particularly where we are looking at different rules, is how permitted and how prohibited do we want our plan to be. So I'm just going to run you through the activity statuses for those that aren't as aware, but we have multiple activity statuses which get used in district plans. So permitted is obviously where no resource consent is required. So councils don't typically go around the district monitoring and enforcing permitted activities. I guess you could if you wanted to, but most of these activities, they fall off the radar, and council doesn't worry about those too much. You can apply for what's called a certificate of compliance to show that your activity, whatever it might be, is a permitted activity, and that just makes it really clear that under that district plan it is actually a permitted activity. So some activities and operations will generally do that. A controlled activity is where a consent is granted, is required and must be granted by council. So controlled activity status is usually something you're pretty confident where the effects are pretty minor, that that council will just want to have a look at it and assess it against the matters of control. So there's a bit of terminology in there about which sections of the RMA that falls under, but generally controlled activities are the ones that council are most comfortable that we're happy that the effects are going to be okay, subject to maybe a few matters of control, and council will grant those applications. Restricted discretionary activities are the next step up, so these require consent as well, and they may be granted or declined depending on how an activity measures up against its matters of discretion. So subdivision's a good example of that, where lots of applications, might be sort of mid-range in terms of effects, and so you might manage those through matters of discretion. But the thing there is, if you've got a really long list of matters of discretion, our argument there would probably be that it's probably best placed to be a discretionary activity. So you're kind of only really wanting between maybe 1 to 3 or 4 matters of discretion. Otherwise, if the effects are more than that you need to manage, you're probably looking at a discretionary activity. So a discretionary activity, again, is where consent is required, and council also have the right to grant or decline the application. These ones require a lot more rigour, so it gives council planners and the consents team a lot more discretion to decide, is this what are the effects of this proposal, and is it something that meets the objectives and policies of our plan? So those ones tend to get a little bit more scrutiny, but certainly not the same as our non-complying activities, which I'll talk you through as well. So yeah, I'd say with discretionary activities, these are the ones where our policy framework becomes the most important, because that provides direction as to whether this activity is something that we want in the district or not. Non-complying objectives and policies become a whole lot more important, because there is a test in the Resource Management Act for non-complying activities. So consent is definitely required, and again, may be granted or declined. I won't bore you with the details of how a non-complying test works from a consenting perspective, but you do need to look at effects very carefully and decide, are these effects going to be something that we can live with in the district or not? And then your objectives and policies are really important here. And so you might decide that the effects are okay, but it doesn't meet any of your objectives and policies, or the other way as well, where you meet your objectives and policies, but the effects might be okay. But that to be honest, that situation doesn't happen very often. So, and I've dealt with applications where the effects, are okay, and it might be only 1 or 2 objectives and policies that it doesn't meet in the plan, and for that reason you balance and weigh it, and then it is approved or also can be declined. So those are the applications that I tend to signal are the ones that we don't want as many of in the district, and they are typically the ones where the activity or application gets publicly notified, because the effects are quite great. And so you'll hear Wendy from the consents team talking about the number of non-complying activities that council currently deals with, because our current district plan has a lot of non-complying activities in it. So that can be a challenge. Most district plans do try and use non-complying only where they're trying to steer applicants away from doing a particular activity. And so then we've got prohibited, which is where you can't even apply for resource consent. So we need to think as council really carefully about these types of activities. And case law has shown us that using prohibitive activity status, council needs to be really clear that this is just an intolerable activity that cannot be provided for in any shape or form. So if you've got any sort of areas where you think, oh, but in this situation it might be okay, you're probably better using a non-compliant activity status than prohibited, because no one can lodge a resource consent application. And I think Paul mentioned an example from Whangarei recently where boundary relocations became prohibited, so no applications could be lodged for simple subdivisions, and I'm not sure how that happened, but people can't even lodge an application in that situation. So there's no point in even attempting to get anything in the door for a prohibited activity. So I think we just need to be really cognizant of prohibited, and that's kind of the last resort. If there's something that we absolutely don't want in our district, that would be the activity status to use. So there might be some examples as we work through the rule framework or various topics as we get through them. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an overview. I can see Councillor De Varis has got her hand up again. Would you like to ask a question there?
Yes, thank you, Catherine. Just to remind you, my name is Delavaris Woodcock. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, that's my apologies
That's
to
okay.
you.
That's okay, no problem. You mentioned that our current district plan has quite a few of non-complying activities which are a headache for the planners. Could you give me some examples of those sorts of issues that might appear as non-complying?
Certainly. So the rural subdivision topic is probably one that I'm becoming most familiar with at the moment. So a lot of those activities, instead of just being a restricted discretionary activity, because of how our rule framework's set up with the various zones. So we've got like the harbour overlays, east and west. So there's a whole bunch of different overlays that apply, and so by default a lot of those activities are falling into non-complying activities because they're in one of those areas, and so that's triggering the need for a lot of non-complying activities when maybe, you know, they don't need to be non-complying, but certainly it puts more onus on the consent planners to process them. And the other one is, I think, in the urban context. So a lot of the urban subdivisions as well, my understanding from Wendy is that a lot of them are failing quite simplistic rules, which then trigger a non-compliant activity status, and it makes them a little bit tricky to get those through a non-complying framework as well, when maybe the effects are actually okay. Paul, did you have a few more examples that you'd like to chip in with there? Because I know you've been all over this for a lot longer than I have.
In many cases, because of the rules that try and capture everything, even if it's not really applicable, those rules in some cases trigger that it becomes a non-complying activity, while you should be able to, under discretionary activity, decide if the effects are no more than minor or if they are more than minor, and then create put the conditions on those particular aspects. An interesting one is, for argument's sake, the cell phone tower. Because of certain height restrictions and those type of things, it all of a sudden becomes non-complying, while strictly speaking, it should be discretionary, because you have to apply your discretion. You know, what are the effects of the cell phone towers as such? The aspects of prohibited is, for argument's sake, and our plan, it is not prohibited to have radioactive material. It's a non-complying activity. While that, to my mind, in New Zealand should be a prohibited activity. So because of the rules in our plan that are so detailed to try and catch every aspect of development, it creates non-complying activities far more than what it should be.
Okay, any more questions on activity status there and consent requirements? No, I'm not seeing anyone. Oh, Councillor Wills, yep.
Yeah, hi. So from that discussion we've just had and thinking of it, even though we're at a strategic level, a specific example where, let's say there's been a 300-metre boundary from industrial properties for a residential to get through without having to get a resource consent, as an example. Does that mean that the intention is to reduce the number of non-complying rules and prefer to go towards that discretionary area of management?
Certainly, as we take different rules to you, depending on what the activity is and what your direction is in terms of how you'd like us to go with our rule drafting. So that example you provided there is quite a key one, because industrial effects on residential activities, for instance, are quite a contentious point. And so in that case, discretionary or non-complying, it might be a bit of a tight line. If we can nail it to a few effects, fine, but often we do need to think carefully about which activity status is the most appropriate one. So yeah, it depends on what we'd like to achieve in the plan, but I would certainly say generally that discretionary activities are certainly where we know the effects are going to be fairly manageable. Discretionary is a more appropriate tool to use than non-complying. Non-complying is almost as restrictive as prohibited, and I think if we think about that in the context I said before about where there might be a bit of wriggle room for a prohibited activity, you're better to place that as a non-complying activity. It sends this signal that non-complying activities don't go there. Council are going to have some really tight objectives and policies around non-complying activities. So that's where we will talk about, avoid and prevent those types of objectives and policies that would marry up with a non-complying activity versus discretionary, where there might just be a bit more wriggle room and we might want to provide for certain activities. So yeah, it just depends fully on the activity that we're trying to manage and control and what those effects are. So, that industrial effect is a good example of one where we would probably have to have a bit of a discussion about what is the most appropriate activity status to signal in the new plan. So does that answer your question, Councillor Wills?
It does, and I guess I raised that. But on the other side, if we go more to discretionary, will that not lead to more challenges of our decisions because there's less black and white basis for them, and therefore potentially greater cost for us and a lot more work for the council staff?
So in terms of challenge, do you mean in terms of hearings, or do you mean in terms of activities not being granted? Is that what you mean?
On the basis that there'll be more, it's easier to follow a set of rules when they're black and white as opposed to when they're grey and then open to interpretation. I'm just asking that question at this level. It's great for us to open it up potentially to discretionary as opposed to non-complying, but will that add to the difficulty in managing the decision process?
Yeah, I don't think it necessarily changes the decision process. I think one thing to bear in mind, though, is non-compliant activities are generally more expensive applications to get through a resource management process. So different application fees apply. Generally, like I said earlier, you're looking at a notified consent versus potentially a non-notified. Like discretionary activities can go either way depending on what it is. So from my experiences there, it just comes back to what the activity is, and what we're needing to control the most. And sometimes until you get that consent application in the door, you're not always going to know, what process it's going to need to go through. And I think discretionary kind of leaves the door open. It's kind of a middle of the road option that most councils use because they're a little bit cautious to go restricted discretionary and just keep it, subject to a few matters. versus non-complying, which is the tougher end of the scale, where, you know, consents are more likely to be declined. So it kind of gives council a bit of wriggle room, and sometimes I think that's a good thing from a consent planner's perspective. Having been in that role for a long time, discretionary activities were my favourite, because it really comes back to what's the plan saying? Are these activities that I'm processing, do they meet what the plan is seeking? So that's where what we're doing with you in terms of drafting objectives and policies is really important for setting the scene there, and what are the types of things that we think are okay versus the things that we don't think are okay.
We have to remember that non-complying activities, they have to pass one of two gates. The one gate is they have to be in accordance with the policies of the plan. And secondly, it says or, previously it says and, but it now says or, the effects are no more than minor. With other words, it can be totally contrary to what is in the plan. While discretionary activity, strictly speaking, you apply the policies and objectives of the district plan. With other words, what you want to achieve in the end. And that is where non-complying activities in many cases try and get past those particular gates that say, oh, well, what I want to do is not going to affect the neighbors, etc. Therefore, you can do it. I think that would be better to have a discretion, and you make it a discretionary activity so that you can assess those particular effects in terms of the policies of the plan, rather than just the effects on the environment.
I have a question.
Yeah, go for it.
Yes, I was wondering about overlays, if we will have them, if they in the new iteration of the district plan, and if it's overlays are bound by rules, and these activity status come underneath that, or which is higher in the hierarchy of legislative compliance? Is yeah.
So the quick answer to the overlays is yes, we will have overlays in the new district plan. And I think one of the things we'll very carefully try and take you through as we go topic by topic is to bear in mind that there are going to be multiple overlays in the district plan, and some will obviously have quite high priority, you know, in terms of their legislative requirements, and perhaps you know, central government might say, you know, this is more important than this issue. So some will have priority, but they will all have rules that we need to draft up that will sit with those overlays. So it could be that you see some activities that are have some restrictions within the overlay, or it could be that we're trying to promote something within the overlay, so it's more enabling. So without confusing everybody at this first session as to what the overlays will be, I think the best message I can give to you at this point is that each topic we bring to you, we will identify what that overlay is and how it works, and step you through what this is going to mean in the context of the zone chapters and how that works across the plan. But just remember that you know, different overlays. I think Paul's landscapes and natural features overlays are a good example of that, where we are legislatively bound to ensure protection. So, you know, protect is a very strong word in terms of RMA speak. So we need to make sure our rules reflect that. And so what they will look like, we'll take you through that when we get to that topic. And I think that's the best place to step you through that, so you've got a clear understanding of how that specific overlay works. That's helpful.
A rule of thumb is that the most restrictive will determine how that resource consent application will be processed.
Thank you, that's very helpful.
Okay.
I think you can go next slide, Catherine.
Yeah, so I think this is pretty much what we've just talked about. But what I wanted to take you through in this slide was just the examples of the policy wording. So probably leading a little bit on from Councillor Wills's question there, which I think was a really good one. the language that we use in terms of the objective and policy drafting is when we're talking about permitted activities, we want to enable or permit. So you'll see when we're drafting things that we want to make permitted activities that will use that type of language and encourage and promote. So these are just examples. You'll see others as we bring them to you as well. Controlled is usually manage, control, or encourage, because those, as I said, are the types of activities that we're anticipating. They just need a resource consent to manage maybe a couple of matters of control, but generally they're always granted because the legislation requires us to grant them. Restricted discretionary is that next step up. So you'll see words there like manage, encourage, restrict, limit, recognise the benefits of, control, or provide for. So that one's got quite a broad range because there's quite a lot of activities that usually sit in that activity category. And then as we move up the ranks to discretionary, you'll see wording like determine, protect, restrict, limit, recognise the benefits of. So those are starting to get a little bit more serious. And then non-complying is where we step it up to that final gear where it's avoid, protect, restrict, limit, and then obviously prohibited is avoid, prevent, prohibit. So that terminology is what we will reflect in terms of our proposed objectives and policies. And then when it comes to the rules, you'll understand the connection between those permitted, controlled, restricted, discretionary, non-complying, and prohibited activities. So yeah, as I mentioned, the waterfall cascade, we have to look from the top. So if we're saying we want to avoid or protect something in the objective, that needs to filter down into the policy, and then the rule would naturally fall in the non-complying or prohibited activity statuses. So you wouldn't do anything kind of contrary to that, otherwise the system doesn't work. So hopefully that just provides a little bit of understanding as to what we're presenting to you in the workshops as far as the language that we've used when we're thinking about where we're trying to head. And so some of that wording, as we've talked about, comes from the steer with that legal hierarchy. So some of our documents actually say, you know, councils need to avoid, councils need to protect. And so we naturally would have to follow direction and put that into the plan. And if we don't do that, then obviously we're in breach of regional policy statements and national direction if we don't. So we might have the Minister for the Environment after us if we try to do anything contrary to that. So hopefully that just gives you a bit of scene setting as far as plan drafting. I think the next part will be Paul leads in. So any more questions on that plan drafting section?
Right, over to you then, Paul, to talk us through some strategic direction.
What we'll do before we get into our strategic direction chapter, I propose that we take a 5-minute break. I've got us at 10:39 a.m. right now, that we'll resume at 10:45 a.m. so that everyone can go and stretch their legs. We've been going for an hour and a quarter now. And then we'll resume with the strategic direction chapter. So this is a good place just to break just for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you.
All right. Kia ora koutou, welcome back everybody. Catherine, thank you for pausing there. And Michael and Paul, and I believe we're now going with our strategic direction chapter, which is going to be discussed next. Thank you. Over to you, team. Thank you. Kia ora.
Kia ora.
Your Worship, councillors, this is basically one of the first chapters that we're going to deal with. And fortunately, we have got, I don't know if you can see it, it's not blurry, but the spatial plan as well as the LTP gave me the starting point of dealing with the strategic direction. Compared that with our present operative plan. Now, the first aspect is that these strategic direction or these matters, objectives, are overarching over the whole plan. So all the chapters that will follow with the implementation of the plan will have to be tested against these strategic directions that we look at. Now, we look at growth, land use and development in the Kaipara district. It gives provides an overall context of the entire district plan, and it only has got objectives. It does not have policies, although some plans do have policies. We are going to take the policies to the different chapters where they belong. And these objectives have primacy over all the other objectives or policies, and that there is no hierarchy. I've identified about 8 objectives. They don't have a hierarchy. They all fit in their particular box, and they give direction for the rest of the plan. The matters that we are addressing are of strategic nature, and as I mentioned, I have identified 8 of them. Council can decide there are more or there are less of these particular aspects. And in previous plans, all of the land users had strategic directions. The national planning standards only requires that the strategic direction on urban form and development have to be provided separately. Next slide, please.
Any
Now-
questions? Any
Okay.
questions prior to launching into this, team? Councillor
No, I'll
Woodcock, have you got a question?
thank you, Michael. I will follow my question after this next slide.
Thank you.
Right, so the first one that we are going to look at, and as I say, there's no hierarchy in them. They will probably be ordered in alphabetical order or something like that, deals with the preservations, the natural and historic environment. Now, the first aspect, which is very important, is that we have to look at the interdependency of the natural environment and the community's health and well-being. That has to be taken into account. We have had criticism, especially from Mana Whenua, is that we put everything in a separate box while everything is interdependent. Then the second aspect is, and that's where I started, the preservation of the coastal environment and the harbours is preserved, and the coastal natural character area is celebrated. This comes out of the National Policy Statement or the Coastal Policy Statement. The third one is important landscape features and significant indigenous vegetations are recognized and protected, and where appropriate, enhanced. And remember, this is now all under the direction on the natural and historic environment. And the last one deals then with the historic environment, the important contribution of the historic environment or heritage, to the district's character is recognized and significant heritage is then protected. So these are some of the points under the national and the natural and historic environment as part of strategic direction. They can be expended, they can be reduced, but that is basically how I interpreted what was in the spatial plans as well as in the LTP. Are there questions, Councillor Delavarez Woodcock or Mayor?
Yes, Mr. Bonders, Paul, is preservation more restrictive than protection?
Preservation would be more protective, and that is to keep it as natural or as the original, while protection is you can enhance, you can change, and you can replant those type of things. So preservation, yes, is a stronger word than protection.
Paul,
Where has his
kia ora. In the recent decision by the court judge to allow the Northland councils extra time to engage with mana whenua regarding the built environment and the landscape environment beside the coastal marine area, have we captured that issue that's kind of rolling over here, if you like, links with the regional policy statement kind of work with the work that we're doing, we as Kaipara District Council are doing over here?
I can speak to that, Paul, if you want.
Okay.
So that so through the chair, that comes directly out of appeals on the regional plan for Northland. And so it's a process, it's kind of a side process which is being run through at the moment. But saying that, we have to give effect to all the provisions in the regional policy statement through our new district plan, and the provisions of the RPS actually give effect to the national policy statements, or sorry, the coastal policy statement as well. So there's that cascade which Catherine spoke to before. So yes, we are cognizant of that, and yes, that new plan will give effect to those provisions.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. We've got more questions here. Councillor Wills and Councillor Vincent, questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, just you use the word, and it's used repeatedly, the word significant, but it's used in a different context. You've got it here as insignificant indigenous vegetation, and then you've got significant heritage is protected. They have different connotations, but you've used them, and like I said, you've used that word repeatedly through this process. Are we going to be able to define what that significant means? For example, significant indigenous vegetation, does that mean by area or by its historical value, or because it's defined differently in the oh gosh, help me here, the government policy that they haven't defined themselves yet as to what we should be protecting as far as indigenous vegetation goes, for example? And significant heritage is protected. Does that mean individually or en masse? What's your views on what that word means in those cases?
In development of the significance, for argument's sake, the significant natural areas of biodiversity, there are studies done to identify what is significant, what is less significant in those particular cases. Part of that is already in the regional policy statement. Then regarding to heritage, Heritage New Zealand have got a definition or a criteria what is significant and what is less significant. So yes, there are different variations of significance. And then I want to bring it back to the interdependency, that it would be wonderful if they were all done in the same way, but there are different standards that are being used for defining what is significant. The other part of the question is it an area or is it a particular feature as such? We are probably going to have areas identified or specific feature as such. I can take, for argument's sake, a tree can be on its own a significant natural biodiversity, or an area as such. On the heritage, it can be in one building, or it can be a group of buildings that one would protect by using those criteria that have been developed on significance.
All right, thank you. Councillor Vincent.
Mr. Mayor, my question for Paul, there's some words there, coastal environments, harbours, coastal natural character. To what extent is that inside our district boundary, and to what extent outside, or are we headed, preparing ourselves for the one plan for Northland?
No, what it is the coastal environment, as I have reported previously to council. We are going to change our coastal, what is our harbour and coastal overlays, to the coastal environment as it is defined in the regional policy statement, which went through a rigorous court assessment, and where the court identified that they were of the opinion that the way the regional policy statement identified the coastal environment was the most accurate definement in terms of the coastal policy statement. So that's one of the aspects. But
Matt, sorry, Paul, just saying that detail will come in front of you next month. The October briefing will actually be talking about the natural environment values in specific detail. Yep.
Just to finish that one particular question, is that the coastal character area is a separate aspect within the coastal environment, but we are only doing that part which is above the coastal marine area, but we will connect to what is in the regional plan.
All right, I think we can move to the next slide if no one's got any further questions. Yep.
Right. The next slide is also a part of our LTP as climate change, or being climate smart. And I have just identified some of the aspects, and we have to recognize and an integrated management approach is adopted by, what I'm saying, taking climate change into account. This might change with the work that Katie is doing on the climate change, enabling the communities to adapt to climate change, which is what we use, and the adaptive pathway, and encourage efficiency in urban form and settlement patterns to make sure that we don't develop in areas that might be affected by climate change. Now, this particular objective will change as we deal with the climate change aspects. Right, any questions on that one? Right, the next one deals with natural hazards, which is climate change is one of the natural hazards, but because we have in the LTP identified climate smart, we have a separate chapter on hazards. In terms of the Act, we have to provide for those. The risk and impacts of natural hazards events on people, communities, and Kaipara economy are minimized by, we have to identify them, and that includes geotechnical matters, it includes climate change, it includes flooding, it includes certain contaminations and those type of things. We have to identify those and look at the risks, and we have to avoid inappropriate new development. And using the word avoid brings us then to what Catherine has discussed. It would probably be a non-complying activity. Becoming better prepared for the consequences of natural disasters, and that includes things like drought and those type of things, and develop a long-term strategies to reduce the risk of harm from natural hazard events. So that links then back to what civil defense would be doing regarding to natural hazards. Also open for discussion and changes where necessary or more detail.
Paul, I have a question for you. This does link with the climate change piece, but the climate change, if you like, is out there, and natural hazards absolutely affects people right now. And the natural hazards layers, the hazard mapping provided by the regional council is already has an effect on the development in Kaipara district. I would, regarding the notion of language in this space, it would be really interesting if we were to separate the natural hazards, all right, to sea level rise and everything else. Because Kaipara district as a place is significantly affected by future proposed, expected, anticipated sea level rise, which is quite separate and a significant impact, quite separate from the other natural hazard events. So just putting this bundle into two streams, one being sea level rise rather than just the euphemism of natural hazards.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I would like consideration to be given to how we can best do that, I think, because at 250 square kilometers, 400 kilometers of roads, so on and so on, being lost at proposed hazard maps, it's important, and that's different from climate change.
Yep, and that's why I have it in two chapters at this particular point in time, but they are interlinked.
Yes, but using that specific language, yeah, that's what I'm keen for, that we're making, again, in plain English, making this very, very clear for the people. Yeah.
Good.
Thank you. Councillor De Lavaris Woodcock, question.
Thank you. My question is about the projections into the future. How long is the council required to cater the district plan to look at? Is it a 100-year projection? So sea level rise, and do we work to the conservative estimates, or how for example,
at least 100 years.
At least 100 years. Okay.
Yep. As per the NZCPS, we're required to take sea level rise into account in coastal hazard planning for at least the next 100 years. That's a time frame that we're actually working with.
And for all other hazards, we have to remember that the Building Act requires that a building has to be safe for at least 50 years. And therefore, in that particular case, it would be at least a 50-year period. But we know buildings are older than that, so we take into account a longer period.
Thank you. Do we also rely on geotechnical data to
Yep.
restrict areas for slips and
Yep.
land
Now,
subsidence?
and that was my first job when I came to Kaipara, was to get and I said to the geologist, I don't want a map of geology because I can't interpret that. I want a maps regarding to geotechnical hazards. And that's why we have got the reports on geotechnical hazards, slips, acid sulfate soils, liquefaction, and those type of things.
I suggest the most appropriate forum for this discussion would be the December briefing, when we specifically are talking about hazard and risk, if that's okay.
Thank you. Thank you. So we'll lift up and carry on at this point, keeping it high level for now. Thank you.
I'm going to skip this. It's still a strategic part of strategic direction, but Catherine will discuss more the detail of what the objectives are going to be in tangata whenua, mana whenua relationship. So let's just skip that for a little bit later. Catherine, the next one, please. Right. A little bit small, but a good photo of our very good agricultural areas. Now, in our strategic direction, and if we look at Kaipara Kai and how we would like to see Kaipara being the food production area north of Auckland, we have identified that rural environment should be a strategic direction, and that is firstly to protect the versatile soils or the high-class soils for primary production. Secondly, to encourage the horticultural, and we are busy with identifying and providing for Kaipara Kai those maps, and limit the proliferation of productive land with lifestyle development. And where lifestyle development takes place, it should be nearer or connected to the urban areas as a form of rural living. So those are basically the strategic directions that we would like to see in the rural environment.
Happy to move on, Paul, or do you want to stop?
Councillor Larson has a question,
Oh, yep.
and Councillor Wethy. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I certainly support the idea of protecting the versatile soils, and your photograph sort of demonstrates what they look like there. I've heard this productive rural land term bandied around quite a lot, and those of us in rural locations know that in fact in Kaipara there's actually quite a lot of marginal land that is not particularly productive. And that's why people are turning it to other uses like lifestyle blocks, because they actually can't make any money out of it. So how would you propose defining which areas are productive, given that, essentially people could irrigate land and make it more productive, but it wouldn't be cost efficient for them to do that?
What we did is, and we're getting now to the rural detail, but what we did is to identify and use the Kaipara Kai identification of what is suitable for horticulture and what is suitable for arable land, as well as those areas that are suitable for dairying, as well as for stock farming. Identified those particular areas, and so as well as the high-class soils. We don't have class 1 soils in Kaipara, but we've got class 2 and 3s in Kaipara. But Kaipara Kai has also looked towards class 4 and 5, where irrigation is possible and wind erosion is curtailed as possible areas. So we've identified those particular areas which we intend to zone, and we'll get to the zonings for rural production, while the other areas would be general rural. But to answer your question regarding to the last one on the proliferation of productive land into lifestyle blocks, what we say is, yes, use that land for lifestyle blocks, but connect them to the urban areas as being the little larger than large lot sections. Don't have these lifestyle blocks all over the place where there are no services, and that's also including social service, schools, and those type of things. Rather have them connected to the urban areas.
Thanks, Paul. So what about situations like we have in a lot of places where we have land that is, from an environmental perspective, better retired from farming, and places that have quite a lot of bush around our coastline and that, where there's an opportunity to provide incentives to people to provide environmental protection. But in order for them to do that, they need to be able to get a return from the land, and the best use for them there is to actually provide lifestyle blocks. But they're not right beside a town.
Well, that's the choice of what the effects are going to be of those particular types of development. I mean, we have had an application for a farm park, despite the fact that certain areas were not so suitable for farming. Those were developed for lifestyle blocks, and the rest of the farm has been preserved for production, for farming production.
Yes, yes.
Can I
Okay,
just
yes.
add to that too, Councillor Larson, that I think
Yeah.
some of what you're alluding to, if I'm picking up, is the environmental benefit lot, which we have in our current plan, where people can retire, say, a set area of natural indigenous vegetation in exchange for a subdivision, and that is something that we'll be exploring and look to bring back to you when we talk through the rural environment in the December briefing.
Briefing, yes. Yep.
December briefing. Thank you. Thank you. We'll move on to Councillor Weddy with his question, then Councillor Vincent. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, I'm just really following on from what Councillor Larson said in the statement you had on the screen. I feel that that's probably fairly general and relies on the interpretation of the person assessing the application. But I hear from what Paul said that you will have a lot more detail, because all I'm saying is, and that's really following on from an earlier statement from Councillor Wills, if you can provide some better black and white boundaries for some of these definitions, it makes it easier for not only the council staff to interpret the district plan when applying, the district plan conditions to any consent applications, but also makes it a lot easier for the communities to work to the plans without getting into too many grey areas. But it sounds as if, Paul, that you are going to be providing that information, that detail,
Correct,
to make it a lot clearer.
correct, correct.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Vincent, question.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I guess the first part of my question for clarification is, are we going to have a definition of versatile soils? Is it just category 3 land and better, or something else?
We have to remember that the LUC classification were done in 1957. In the meantime, Manaki Whenua is busy with what they call the S plans, which does not only look at the soil as such, it looks at drainage and all these type of things, which is far more defined, and that is what they used in Kaipara Kai, the more refined aspects. The national policy statement on high-class soils would probably still use the LUC 1, 2, and 3, the regional policy statement has used 1, 2, 3, but has added to them some of the additional conditions or attributes to be taken into account. We have decided to use the Kaipra SMAP interpretation that was done by Manaki Whenua as the more up-to-date version of the land use classification as such. It fits to some extent in the LUC classification, but we will see how they're going to change the NPS on high-class soils. If they use the crude 1, 2, 3, then we will use the crude 1, 2, 3. But I think, and I've specifically asked them to have a look at the SMAPs and a more sophisticated way of defining those particular soils.
Thank you. Thank you. Councillor Wethy, I note your hand is still up, but I assume you're finished with your question. Thank you.
He's on mute.
I haven't finished with my questions yet.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Vincent, and then Councillor Wills. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Look, I just with the last part of the last bullet point in the presentation about aggregating lifestyle blocks around existing urban areas, I have a problem with that. I think that's unduly restrictive, and I'd be keen for us to see if there are other ways of directing or encouraging those other lifestyle blocks. I suppose what I'm thinking of from a social dimension, I'm regularly encountering these days people, might be wearing my other land care hat, Harbour Care hat on, of people from a huge diversity of backgrounds who are attracted to the area, and they're not restricting them, or it doesn't appeal to them to be part of a built-up area. They want actually some space in the country. So, and those people are adding diversity to the social environment, if you like. So I'd like to see if it is possible for us just to unleash the shackles a little more than perhaps what you're suggesting.
So Councillor Vincent, thank you for that. Remember, we've got the December briefing that we will be able to go into this in the kind of detail that you're going into here. I'd say for this briefing today, this is at a very high level about what the heads, if you like, of what the staff are talking to here with the strategic direction in general. And my understanding of this is that it's about the highly productive soils rather than general lifestyle blocks anywhere. Yeah. So, but that's other work for another day. Councillor Wills, and then thank you, Councillor Wills.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And with respect, this is that paragraph. I support the other councillor. They've been pushing, the planners have been pushing this particular aspect with regard to future lifestyle development, and it's a strategic direction. So I'm providing my feedback is that other councils, and I've looked into this, allow lifestyle development where it already exists. And communities like Tangaroa and their falling school roll can't afford to lose more population than they already are. I don't want to get into detail, but this is actually at the strategic level. I'm giving my direction that I want them to broaden the opportunity for those lifestyle properties for future development for Kaipara. Not necessarily willy-nilly, but definitely to take into account where existing lifestyle properties exist as one of the criteria, please.
Thank you.
And because at the moment, this is a path that the planning department, no disrespect, has been going down since I've been a councillor, and I'm asking for a strategic change in direction.
I think that we have to look at that, the wording existing urban areas or existing settlements or communities or something like that.
Yeah, I was just going to add to Councillor Will's question. Some of what you're looking for might also be unpacked when we talk about the settlement zones. So we have taken an approach where around some of the areas like you mentioned Tangata there, looking at how we can best kind of support those local communities with some more appropriate zoning that actually allows smaller lots than even lifestyle zone sizes would allow. So I think when we get to the
For
rural
future growth
conversations,
purposes.
yeah, I think when we talk about that in December, you'll probably get the gist of what I'm talking about. But we're looking at all of that at the moment from a high level view, and obviously looking at what the spatial plans provide, because they're our guidance and direction for what the communities wanted to see in those towns and villages.
And
I
thank you for that, Mr. And thank you for that, because that does follow on, because the spatial planning did suggest encouraging communities to return to those small areas like Kaihu and Tangata. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, Councillor Larson.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, I won't. I'll try to avoid getting drawn down into the greater detail and just keep us at this strategic level. And that third point, which is being referred to, this limit the proliferation of productive rural land, to me doesn't even make sense, because it's not about the proliferation of productive rural land at all. That's my first point. You're talking about the proliferation of development in rural productive land, I think, are you not?
I take your point, yes.
Anyway, that needs a redraft, but I agree with the points that are being raised around this direction to try and force everyone to have their lifestyle blocks around towns, because that's not why people are coming here. And our strategic direction as a council was to have a simple and enabling district plan, and some of the things I'm seeing starting to get quite complicated. So I just want to come back to that as our sort of overarching direction. And just bear with me, Mr. Mayor, I will not take more than 30 seconds, but some of the things that we have problems with in our current district plan that don't work are where we have these 12 and 20 hectare controlled activity lot sizes, which are a lot size which is not appealing to people because it's too big for people to handle, but not big enough to be a proper economic unit. And then we have, you know, environmental benefit rules where you can only get sort of 2 or 3 lots. And so what both those things do is they mean that if you're to bring access and what have you in, the distance to bring it is too far, or the number of lots is too few, and so people don't have great difficulty taking up with that opportunity. And then there are so many obstacles in terms of their economic input to get the lots that it makes it very difficult. If we're trying to be enabling doesn't mean open things up completely, but it means make things work where we want them to work. And so I think that if we're going to start putting limitations like this at a strategic level now, then we're really shutting things down and we're not being enabling. Because I actually think a lot of people would like to have a lifestyle block out on the coast, on the Kaipara, where the bush is protected and they've got riparian planting and they've got a nice little house site. That's what people want. They don't want to be living on the outskirts of some little rural town so much because they can walk in because there might be a post office or something. That's not what people are after. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Delavaris Woodcock.
Thank you. I'd like to counter and sort of object to the direction that this discussion is going, because we have a climate crisis on our hand, and if this district plan is going to work, then we need to listen to what our officers are trying to do. And for food security, they are trying to make a set aside land that is going to enable us to feed ourselves and our population going forward, and to carry this discussion into objecting to overly restrictive lifestyle is contrary to the intent of what we're trying to discuss here, and we're going far too down deep in the detail. And I would just like to offer a different opinion, that we must, and we would be remiss as a council if we failed to protect food security going forward in a climate world that we live in. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Councillor de Oliveira Woodcock, your hand is still raised, and Councillor Larson, your hand is still raised, but I assume you've both made your statements there. Thank you. Paul, back to you, and Michael, back to you, but I think you've heard clear direction from and statements here from elected members, and there's going to be an interesting discussion in December when we get into some detail.
Absolutely.
In this space.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Right, Paul.
Thank you. Move on.
Next one. Right now, the portion that, in terms of the national planning standards, we have to provide for in more detail, deals with the urban form and development. In other words, not the rural area, but the urban form and development. And in that particular case, we are using the spatial plans to a very great extent, and are at this point in time also busy identifying those growth areas. So the first point is to provide a strategic direction on the appropriate location, shape and form of the future urban areas in the Kaipara district. That has to a great extent been done by the spatial plans, except the spatial plan is a 30-year plan, as is the infrastructure strategy. And at this particular point in time, we are now looking at what is appropriate for the lifetime of the district plan to identify those particular aspects. The second point is provide a range of lifestyle choices and types of buildings. Now, at this point in time, the whole district plan is very monolithic. It has got one density, and the intention is that we should provide for various types of densities. Then we will enable appropriate residential growth and development that is consolidated, compact, and feasible and well designed. Now that is going to create a redevelopment, or the possibility of redevelopment of existing properties in the various towns. And what we basically say, we should enable those areas to be able to redevelop. Then the last point is recognize the importance of livability, connectivity and affordability in our towns, and that then also connects to the provision of services. So the direction here is that we have to allow for expansion in terms of what we've seen in the spatial plans, but we have to see what is the lifetime of the district plan, and also enable inside the towns for redevelopment to take place.
Paul, I have a question. How, and we see on the screen there a picture of Dargaville. Now, Dargaville has more villas than any other town its size in all of New Zealand as an architectural style of housing. And they're on large sections and so on and so on. So when you're talking here about consolidated, compact, so on and so on and so on, how do we retain the character of the current town as well as grow it in the sense that you're talking about?
The best way of dealing with that particular aspect is to identify not heritage buildings as such, but as heritage areas or character areas in a particular area, and look at those particular areas more specifically, and how, if that, for argument's sake, if one has got a whole block of these villas, and you can subdivide the back portion of it, that it does not create a difference in character, that your building style, etc., fits into that particular aspect, if you would subdivide those particular things. But what should happen is those areas should be identified. It's not only Dargaville, we've got in Mangateroto and in Mangawhai, these type of character areas that we should identify and say, well, this is how we're going to deal with those particular blocks as such. But those have to be identified.
Okay, that's interesting. Thank you. Councillor Weddy.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, Paul, and this is, not sure it's in the right order, but one of the attachments to the papers that went out was associated with information you're going to provide for the November briefing, but you wanted to get some socialising of it at this point in time. And this is relating to the the more detailed definition of the different zones that you're talking about.
Yep.
And one of the questions I'd just ask here is that when it comes to the residential zones, you've got basically three categories: the high density, the medium density, and the low density. And I'm just not sure whether by just having it at very, very loose sort of definitions is going to make it very difficult for people to know what is really being referred to. Are you going to be putting in a range of lot sizes, etc., that would comply with those sort of three definitions? For example, I can understand high density because we understand that, and that should be serviced by reticulated three waters, etc. But certainly in Mangawhai, medium density residential zones, I think, would probably be largely categorised as the old quarter acre section, which in Mangawhai Heads in particular, there were a lot of sections that are around between 1,000 and 1,250 square metres. Now that is probably medium density compared to the higher density where you're getting down to 500 or less square metres per section. Now in your definitions here, a medium density residential zone has to be serviced by reticulated three waters infrastructure with sufficient capacity available. Now there's an awful lot of areas in this area in Mangawhai which are in this medium density type category, which are outside the connectable zones for the wastewater plant, which would be unlikely to be hooked up in the future. So I'm just wondering whether that's being a bit restrictive, but it would help a lot if you're going to actually specify a medium density block as being one that's between X and Y square meters, or a high density between X and Y, etc., etc. Is that your intention to give a little more detail on that?
That's in.
Yes.
That's it. Intention. I have to say that when I typed it up, I put in the lot sizes, and we decided not to give it to deal with it now, but to actually apply the chapter in the spatial plan that actually identifies what those different areas and what they should be, and discuss it then in November when we get the zoning maps to you with the detail of them.
Okay, thank you. So this
Okay,
will
thank you. No, that's fine.
discussed in detail in November. All right.
Absolutely.
Thank you. So is Councillor De Lavaris Woodcock, your hand is raised. Is this a high level question or a detailed one for November?
High level, I think. I'm just carrying on from your concern, Mr. Mayor, about the change of densities and whether or not we might have an unintended consequence or perverse consequence by losing character because we're encouraging rather than cross-leasing, recognising that cross-lease development doesn't always work for the best use of the site, and whether or not that will lead to removal of character houses to allow for, you know, 3 townhouses, for example, in our heritage areas. Just a point to consider.
My reaction again is, if an area is a heritage area, it should be shown as a heritage area. and they could have certain requirements.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. And there's also a written question in the chat box, either Michael or Paul, to address from Councillor Vincent. Does this contemplate mixed use in urban areas such as residential in conjunction with commercial?
In some locations, yes, and again, we'll talk through this in detail at the November briefing. It's the
Lovely.
short answer for that. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, clear. Councillor De Livaris Woodcock, your hand is still raised. Is that okay? Thank you. All right. So at this point, I think, Paul, we can move on, please, from urban form and development to the next slide. Thank you.
Right. Now, as part of urban form and development, the point of departure to have a more compact urban areas, the 4 words that I usually use is infill, and especially if we change the coastal environment to make it possible that you can have infill, subdivision or intensification. I've got several requests regarding to people who have sleep outs who would change it to a residential area. Contiguous development, we would like to have, rather than jump from one development to the other development with a piece of unused pipe, to have contiguous development, no leapfrogging. Transition, with other words, the higher density would be around the town centers, and then outside suburbs would be lower density. But there has to be a choice so that people who would like to live in small sections or people who like to live in lifestyle blocks, that provision is made for those particular aspects. So the 4 phrases, infill, contiguous development, transition, and choice, are the matters we would like to test all applications against. And here I bring back the matter of the character area and amenity values, and ensure that services can be provided.
Okay, thank you. Moving on.
I think that concludes that section. Paul, is that all you
Yep,
wanted to
correct.
cover on that section?
Yep.
Oh, sorry, we've got a question.
Oh, I
from
had a
Councillor
question
Wills.
on that last slide. I had
Okay,
my-
sorry, Councillor Wills. Sorry, thank you. Raising your hand now. Thank you. Visible.
Just try
So
and
my
go
question's
back.
on the last slide.
Hang on.
Okay,
There we go.
sorry, not questions. At the strategic level, and now I've completely, excuse me while I get my screen back. Contiguous development, no leapfrogging. Totally agree with the strategic direction, but possibly the inclusion of subject to inundation, future inundation, restricting that ability to be contiguous. I'll use as an example the Darwell Racecourse is potentially a large future development for Darwell, but to get to there we'd have to go past a whole lot of area that's not suitable for development at this stage. Just wanted to raise that. The transition, sorry, Paul, and the transition one, I note that in Auckland, their high density development has been largely based not necessarily around the town centre, but around transport hubs. Just something I wanted to throw out there, that's in our future thinking is how we move these greater numbers of people around our community. And the other one was the bottom one, they said ensure that efficient and effective on-site and articulated infrastructure is provided in a sustainable manner. I'd like to also just throw in there from my perspective as a councillor that the word affordable appears somewhere, because it has to be restricted by what we can resource and do. And we agreed that in our spatial planning that we would only build what we could afford as development came, and not future design and not be able to afford that financially. So affordable is something I'd like to include in that. I don't know if your feedback on that, please.
Yes, and in my other document, recognize the important livable, connective, and affordability. Yes, affordability will definitely be there.
All right, thank you. Thank you. So moving on, so we're now headed towards the next item, which is about the Tangata Whenua chapter. In the spirit of where we were exactly an hour ago, I propose that we break at this point and just for 5 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes to so everyone can stretch their legs. Thank you, and we will resume at 11:45. Thank you. Thank you with the Tangata Whenua chapter. Kia ora.
Excuse me, Mayor Smith.
Hello.
We're expecting that some of our mana whenua partners may well be with us online here. So when we get back on, would you like to just reach out and see if they are online or we can get them to introduce themselves?
Certainly, thank you.
We were hoping that someone from Te Roroa Snow will be with us, and hopefully Fiona from Te Riohau will be with us too. So I'm just not sure if they are online with us or not. So hopefully at least one of them will be with us.
All right, thank you. All right, we'll make a start and welcome back to section 3 of today's briefing, which is our information about our Tangata Whenua chapter. And for this section, we have representatives of our Tangata Whenua partners for Kaipara District Council are joining us. So we have Fiona Kemp and Katarina Tautuhi online with us. Kia ora korua, tēnā koe, tēnā korua, and welcome. So Fiona and Katarina, is an opportunity here for you to introduce yourselves, if you would like to do so. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Your Worship, and kia ora to all the councillors and the Konehera staff. So yeah, great opportunity to sit here and have be involved as a partner to the Crown and to yourselves. I'll just quickly introduce myself and then we can kick on with the business. Work for Te Reo Settlement Trust for the Environs arm. I actually whakapapatū Ngāti Awa, but I married into this area through some of you may know Russell Kemp. I married his last son. Be the better looking one, I'm sure. So yeah, really lovely to be here. I also worked for council some years ago when Mark and Jason were also on board in different roles. So ka pai. So I'll just mihi to all of you, and that's me. Katarina may not be able to hear. She just had some difficulty with her sound. So yeah, thank you for having me on board, Your Worship.
Kia ora. Thank you, Fiona, for that, and Katarina. Yeah. So handing back to Michael for this presentation. Thank you.
Yes, Catherine, are you with us for the presentation? Thank you.
Sure are. So kia ora toto everybody, and I think Virginia is online as well. Virginia has been helping in the development of the Tangata Whenua chapter. She's assisting with preparing the Section 32 report, which is a exciting piece of work at the moment. So I just want to acknowledge her in this work today as well. So today, the Tangata Whenua chapter is going to be a little bit loose because the plan with this, which we've always talked to elected members about, is to work collaboratively with our partners at Te Reo and Te Roroa. And we have been having some amazing conversations about it, but we haven't got down to business as far as working through the drafting of what that section will look like. And we had planned to have a catch up just before we went into level 4 lockdown. So it hasn't happened, but the plan is to work collaboratively with the iwi, and I don't want for there to be any surprises, you know, by presenting something that we've drafted and they haven't had input into. So what I'm going to take you through today is what we need to do. And so that's looking at the National Planning Standards directions. And Virginia and I have drafted some strategic objectives, which Paul mentioned the placeholder for earlier. And we have circulated these to both iwi partners and Fee. I'm not sure if you've had much of a chance to look at it because it was only a few days ago, but certainly this is a chance to just shape what those look like, because we'd like these strategic objectives to formulate a holistic view for the whole district plan. And so when I talked about the cascade, we'd like all of the objectives and policies to be considering the Tangata Whenua objectives in everything we do, district plan related and resource management activity related. So So hopefully that frames up what I'm going to talk to you about. I think the other key thing from this slide as well is just to give you some context in terms of the Tangata Whenua chapter sits separately to the Maori purpose zone, and it will sit separately to the provisions around the sites and areas of significance to Maori, which aims to protect those cultural sites and our special taonga and wahitapu sites across the Rohe. So it's really important that we just recognise that those chapters will be bringing to you a bit later in the piece when we talk about the Maori purpose zone, and then sites and areas of significance is actually going to come to you when we talk about the historical heritage chapter, and there's quite a bit more work to do in that space. So at this point, there's not really much to present on. So the next slide I'm going to take you through is the National Standards Directives. So if you're having a look at any more recently drafted plans, you'll see that the Tangata Whenua chapter is quite a generic chapter which recognises iwi and hapu. It also establishes the relationships that our local authorities have with Tangata Whenua, and so there's a lot of interesting information in there about background to those relationships and the kind of key documents. So we've got iwi and hapu planning documents as well, so they all get put into there, and then consultation, which I think is probably the most important part of the plan, is how do we work collaboratively with iwi to make sure that they're on board with decision making and being included in that process for resource consent. So many of you will know that Fiona's team and Katerina do, and Snow, sorry, I know Snow's not here, but they do a lot of cultural impact assessments for resource consents and do have quite a full-on workload as far as looking at applications when consent requires input from iwi and hapu. So consultation is really important and will become more important when we're dealing with things like the sites of significance to Māori, because there'll be activities that we'll talk about in the briefing when we come to that, about you know, that relationship and how that should be treated. So this discussion today is really just framing up those conversations in the detail, which we will bring back to you probably early next year once we've worked collaboratively through what that looks like. But you can check out other plans to see what they've done. We're looking at what other plans like Far North, we've got Timaru, they're quite recent, Kapiti. There's quite a few examples out there of what other councils have done, but I think it's really important to highlight today that we want something that's Kaipara focused. We want something that recognises our partnership with our iwi authorities, and we want them to be collaboratively involved in what that looks like, so that, you know, it gives true meaning to the partnership, and that they are comfortable with what details in there. So those conversations are in train at the moment. So I'm just going to spend a bit of time talking you through the planning standard directives, and I think this is really important because this is what you will see when we eventually prepare the chapter. Now these are mandatory requirements set out in the planning standards, and so our council obviously needs to factor these in and draft accordingly. So the first one there is, and sorry, this is a bit of a wordy slide. I do apologise for that. The planning standards are a bit wordy, but a history of the iwi hapu within the Rohe and the iwi hapu relationship within the Rohe, environmental management perspectives and values. So what we want to capture there is, you know, what's the background? What are the kind of key things that each partner brings to the relationship, and also we want to make sure we really capture their values in respect to resource management issues. And so I'll talk through the iwi management plans a little bit more, but if you have a good look at each iwi management plan that's already been prepared, so that sets out their key values that they've identified for them as specific iwi authorities. And I think it's really important that we pick up on that and include that into our district plan the best way that we can, to capture the essence of what they truly value so that it's really clear to anyone reading our district plan how those work in that relationship. So that's what we're trying to get at there. There's a description of resources of significance to tangata whenua. So obviously we'll work through that and see what that looks like, and what again that comes out of their iwi environmental management plans as well. There's, where agreed with the iwi authorities, a list of relevant iwi authorities, and where possible this should include a link to iwi authority website. So that's pretty much a given with our two. I'm quite sure we'll have details on that. A description of the relationship of iwi o hapu with ancestral lands, water sites, wahitapu, and interests in resource management. So this reflects the requirements of the Resource Management Act at the moment. And then an explanation of how iwi and hapu values have been considered when preparing the plan or are reflected in the plan. So again, that's where I was talking about those values from the iwi environmental management plans. And then an overview of outcomes of resource management arrangements from treaty settlement and post-treaty settlement agreements. So this is where we get to grips with what has fallen out of those treaty settlement agreements, and making sure we have regard to what those are, and making sure they're clearly set out in the tangata whenua chapter. So then that leads on to an explanation of what the statutory acknowledgements for the district and region are, and where possible this should include a link to those statutory acknowledgement legislation. So that's all available publicly anyway, so anyone looking for that can find that. But I think it's really handy because we'll be working at an electronic plan, just nice to have it tucked in there. People who are interested in what that statutory acknowledgement is can just click on the link and it'll take them there, and there's some really awesome information on those websites. So I think it's a good extension of our district plan. And then, so a brief explanation of how statutory acknowledgements affect the plan, and or how statutory acknowledgements are reflected in specific objectives, policies and methods, including rules, if any. So that's where we need to make sure that the district plan is talking to what's included in those statutory acknowledgements, and making sure that our objectives, policies and methods do pick those up. And then if any statutory acknowledgement requires a specific resource management process, identification of that process. And so that might be that something happening within one of the statutory acknowledgement areas might require a specific process. So a good example of that might be, wahitapu sites that are identified within that area, and making sure that adequate consultation happens and that the plan actually does direct how that should happen, to make sure that anyone developing land can understand, yep, I do need to go and talk to iwi about that. And it could be that, a cultural impact assessment is required, or maybe not, depending on what the iwi say. So yeah, just making sure that we have clearly documented a process for that to happen. So that's Directive 3, which is probably the biggest one. Does anyone have any questions on that for anyone of the team? And I'm reaching out to Fiona and Katerina as well here, if anyone's got any questions on that directive before I move on to the next couple.
Yes, I have a question, and so this relates to our tangata whenua who aren't mana whenua. So this is such as kapehu marae, for example, who are at Whangauna back to Tararawa in the north. So how does everyone get captured? Te Parafo, Te Kuihi, the rest of our partners that the council works with, and if we were to look at the Taharoa Domain Committee, we're working with Te Kuihi, and yet they, if you like, as hapu, are falling potentially under the radar here. And so I'm just trying to say, how do we capture everybody?
Yep. Yep. So we will recognise some of those governance committees that operate, which are very much like the Taharoa, Domain, Harding Park. I think those are the key two. And certainly the Tangata Whenua chapter does take a holistic view, not just to the iwi partners, but Tangata Whenua, mana whenua generally as well. So we will, need to talk about those relationships and what maraes we cover in the district. All of that information sits in here. And so as part of this collaboration, it is our intention to be talking to all of those people as well, so they're aware of what we're doing. And I think they're going to be probably most interested when we get to the Maori Purpose Zone, and certainly sites and areas of significance as well, because those are the things that affect them directly as, mana whenua, tangata whenua. And I know it's probably a little bit difficult grappling with the RMA definitions around tangata whenua, mana whenua, but the intention here is that we capture all of the relationships, and particularly the one with our iwi partners. So if that gives you any confidence, Mia.
So yes, it does. Thank you, Catherine. For myself, I have no difficulty at all with the difference between mana whenua and tangata whenua in a definition sense. And to me, they're very, very clear. But just to take this to the next level, and I guess this links back with Councillor De Lavaris Woodcock's concern from earlier in our briefing today about the upcoming other legislation to replace the RMA, because that legislation talks to mana whenua, and the direction that we're seeing coming there is that it will be mana whenua who are involved in the regional planning bodies. It will be mana whenua who will be being talked with. And I'm really clear on the difference in these layers here, but what I don't want us to do is to set people up for disappointment later, and in the layers of what is being talked about here. It's complex, but certainly we're seeing a different approach. And for our wonderful Kaipara District Council, we are working at the closest level to the ground, whereas some other councils, literally, when they get to Hapu and they get to tangata whenua, they go, it's so complex and there's so many people to talk with that they don't. But we in Kaipara, we do, which is yay. It's all good. So I'm just going, how do we best make the best advantage of all of that? And just before you answer that question, I'd like to welcome back Deputy Mayor Curnow, who's been attending the Civil Defence and Emergency Management meeting for the last hour and a half. So thank you for rejoining us now and representing Kaipara at that forum. Yeah, thank you. So Catherine, any comments on my question? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good question, Your Worship. And I guess, you'll know from council submission that we helped prepare that we've raised obviously concerns in terms of what the new RMA NBA looks like in a mana whenua, tangata whenua space. And I guess because at the moment, in terms of plan preparation, we are following the RMA as we know it at the moment. We're just sticking to what definitions we have right now, being cognizant that it may change direction, and we've spoken about that earlier today. I think that we just have to be abreast of these changes, and as they happen, have those discussions with our partners and with elected members to make sure we're all on that same page in front. And it might mean that we have to redraft or reword potentially, depending on what those outcomes are. But remember, we're hoping to get in before the NBA bill is actually presented to Parliament in December next year. So I think the best we can do as planners at the moment is just try and stay on one trajectory until it changes. But yeah, I don't know if the partners, Fee, do you have anything that you would like to add in that space? Because I feel like you guys are the ones that are sort of at the cold face when it comes to these changes, and you'll know from the MBA suggestions that things do change, and the relationship, we're not really clear on how that works in terms of our existing partners and what that will look like into the future. So do you have any comments or questions in that space, or? Oh, I think you're on mute, Fee.
Hello. Sorry, I think it was covered in the discussion document in terms of how do you engage tangata whenua. You know, as we know, mana whenua have mechanisms, statutory tools that we are able to obligate council to remain engaged with us. But I think council might have to think outside the box as we move into the MBA and what that joint relationship will look like in terms of implementing the new MBA. The spatial plan's more of a tool to engage all tangata whenua anyway. So, but it's more around the decision making and who actually sits at that table. I can't say or speak for any hapu or iwi or a whānau collective that now resides within the Kaipara District Council's rohe, but council staff will have to consider what that looks like. Yeah, that's probably all I could say to that. Just for clarification, you know, we've also got Ngāti Wai, Tauranga o Ngāti Whātua, and I think probably further up, Ngāpuhi will all settle their claims, and then they'll have statutory tools whereby, but by then I would say that the RMA would have come in, the reform would have come in, and then, you know, that cross the bridge when you get to it. I'm not saying, you know, as mana whenua we should be having the exclusive step up, but this is the benefits of those statutory tools. But that doesn't mean that we wouldn't manaki all those that sit with us in the rohe as well. So that's my only commentary to that. If any other councillors or your worship want to direct questions or clarification around what our vision or our aspiration is around this section, I could probably say that for a later time because it'd be quite detailed in terms of how these directives are met through, you know, our desired outcomes and objectives, and how do we embed that into your plan that maintains that alignment, but also being allowed to have activities where we need to sort of go, hey, we think that's discretionary too, or we think that's non-compliant as well. And where do those greys start to get wiped out? Because we know that applicants who are getting resource consents may go, I don't understand why X, Y, Z. So it's sort of putting it in plain English as to why, and if it's incorporated in the plan, you know, we've got to go through our hapu plans and have a look and have a discussion or caucus amongst ourselves as mana whenua and tangata whenua, so nobody's missed out. Hope that's helpful.
Cool. Thank you, Fiona. That's awesome. Mary, are you happy for me to carry on? Cool. All right, so Directive 4. So this is the local authority relationships part of the chapter. And so this is where we need to provide a list of formal relationship agreements between tangata whenua and the local authority. So this is where we would set out our mana enhancing agreement, or the MEA, which we have, and the MOU, or Memorandum of Understanding, which we have with both of our iwi partners there. And so yeah, we talk about any agreements. So this is the place to do that, and how they relate to resource management functions. And it says there, we're agreed with tangata whenua, a link to the document agreement document can be provided. So I think that's a good place, assuming that our partners want that to be included in the district plan. And so Directive 5 there is, where the iwi and hapu planning documents sit. So I've talked about the environmental management plans, which each of our iwi partners has. And so this is where we would provide a list of those documents, and it says where possible, we should include a link to those documents. And my understanding is they're all publicly available anyway, so there shouldn't be any issue putting those as a link and an extension to the district plan. And there's some great things in those. I found them really interesting to read when I joined Kaipara, so I'd encourage you all to have a good look at those. And this is where we provide a description of how the local authority has taken the iwi hapu planning documents into account in the plan. So how we do that. It suggests a flowchart of how iwi and hapu planning documents are used, and then if relevant and agreed parts of the iwi planning documents. So again, this is quite key as far as identifying what are the values and what are the core things that council needs to take from these documents and make sure that they flow on through our plan and that our decision making in terms of plan making stems from this. So we will certainly have more to say on that once we've pulled this chapter together.
Thank you, Catherine.
sorry.
At this point, I see Fiona Kemp's hand is up.
Oh, sorry, Fiona. I'll just go back.
Your Worship, just a quick question around two things. I hear you using the word take into account, which we know is the lesser of all the sort of legal terms. Is there going to be an opportunity where, in terms of some of the provisions within the plan, where we're able to have either particular regard to or must give effect to, are those incorporated at this tangata whenua space, given that there's no rules and policies attached to these objectives, but will they come out later within, or how will that be included? That's the first question.
Okay. Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, yep. So I'll answer that first, if you like, Fiona. So you'll see from the wording of some of our objectives that we've got that. So these are the strategic objectives, and then as we move through the plan into the more specific Māori purpose zone chapter and also the historical heritage, where we will have a specific section on the sites and areas of significance, you'll probably see that language reflected through there. Like, I mean, you as well as anyone knows that the sites and areas of significance are given protection through the provisions of the RMA, and so we need to reflect that as well. And we've also got the regional policy statement guidance as well. So the language in that section, for example, will be a lot more specific and give that regard to those provisions there.
I might have not heard some conversations earlier, but just this strategic direction only gives a very high level objective.
Yes.
Okay, no, that's fine. The mana whakahono arohi. I just, this might be my naivety and not knowing, but I assumed that was a tool that was available only at a regional level, and only at the request of an iwi. However, regional council has provided templates for hapu to be able to undertake that. Is that a tool that Kaipara will be looking at to work in the tangata whenua? And given that the Paewawhio's comment there through Te Tiriti, obviously that will still come in with the MBE, but in the interim, how are you building towards incorporating those values and aspirations from tangata whenua and those that haven't been captured, that don't have those statutory tools? Will you be looking at a mana whakahonua iwi agreement?
Yeah, that's a really good question there. And I think part of the directions, so remember that the national planning directives are to accommodate all different types of plans. So some plans are unitary plans versus our plan, which is not. So the answer is I don't know at this point because I haven't been across that. But if Michael or Paul have any particular comment on that, I would be keen for your input if you've got any questions, comments on that.
As far as I know, that Whangarei has got a agreement with Pātuari Kiki, so I think it can be done on territorial authority level, but I have very little knowledge about how it works and how effective it is.
Thanks for that, Paul. I'm only suggesting that because in terms of the long-term game and what preempting the changes that will come through from the SPA and the MBA, that these might be tools that the council might consider to allow for those aspirations to, I don't know, and values to be incorporated now moving into those new legislation. So that was my only comment. I'll stop there.
No, I think that's good, and I think certainly at the moment, obviously, we've got our MEA and MOU, which we do obviously and will accommodate through the district plan here, and so any additional things we can talk about and what that relationship means.
If I can also add here to Fiona's question, the mana whakahono arohe are led by iwi or hapu, two councils, not the other way around. So councils, if you like, sit open to receive those requests and for the work in that space regarding those agreements. This is all within the RMA, and the so district councils can absolutely have mana whakahono arohe agreements with iwi and hapu in their areas. And so, yeah, so Paul's right regarding how Whangarei works in that space. So the council is open to that. The RMA in its entirety, and again, we talked to that, is going to be completely replaced by a different legislative structure. We don't yet know what that is in its entirety. So it's the door is open, but it's a complicated space here regarding that. So I hope, Fiona, that's helpful information at this point. And I'm happy to have further conversations about that as well with you. Also, I've got another question and or point to your earlier question about how take into account aspects of some of the iwi plans and hapu plans and how they actually get embedded in the hierarchy here. One of my understandings in this space is that where there's a treaty settlement, for example, the legislative language in those documents prescribes how it lands into district plans. One of the pieces that is currently not yet concluded is, of course, the Kaipara Moana Treaty Settlement, and one of the discussions that has been happening around the Kaipara Moana Treaty Settlement is the hierarchy, again, the legal hierarchy of the take into account, give effect to, have regard to, though that legal hierarchy, and where that treaty settlement document will land and what that will then prescribe, because there is discussion there between the Crown and within that treaty negotiation, which is not yet resolved as to where that hierarchy is. So that then would come through and trickle down absolutely into this district plan. And that is all to be revealed when that is concluded. it's unknowable yet what that is. It's unknown and unknowable yet what that is. Fiona, question.
Sorry, just really quickly, that was more around the hierarchy of how those legislation pieces will come in and how they get embedded into. I think one consideration is also the MACA claims. So again, that's another part that's also just more in the regional space, but also to be considered around the land use around it. And in terms of the MACA claim, which well, it's title, isn't it? That's pretty much what that particular process is. But I just sort of was thinking along the lines of where Kaipara District Council is now in terms of how we prepare for the changes that are coming. And I understand that we should park it and just keep moving forward. But just to let you know, Urioi has engaged fully with the policy writers on that particular legislation. I'm very keen to have your policy writers having a conversation on actually how does that work jointly. So I'm just putting it out there for you, Catherine. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll move on. Catherine, carrying on, please.
Oh, through you, Your Worship. It looks like there's another question from Councillor De Lavaris Woodcock.
Oh, I can't see that. Sorry.
Thank you, Catherine. My question is about the interdependency of the natural environment being at the forefront of decision making as one of the 4 strategic objectives that we're working towards. And I'm interested in to not necessarily giving effect to the formal relationships with mana whenua and iwi and whānau and hapu, but more outside in the kind of falling in the gaps area, because I know that there are obviously places in the rohe that have strong links, and then there are others that haven't because of history, and wondering how we can still give effect to and see the well-being outcomes linked to the environment where this relationship is not so clearly set out in agreements and memorandums of understanding, or so do you see what I'm getting at? Is how we can give effect to the well-being, the community, bring that into the forefront of decision making with the cumulative effects of development as it occurs in the next 30 years, how we can still keep that at the forefront of our decision making if it doesn't fall into one of these formal relationship agreements.
Yep. So I can probably provide a quick overview of in terms of when we are plan making, so what we're doing for the next couple of months. You'll be aware of the 4 well-beings, which is your social, economic, environment, and cultural. I've probably got the order around the wrong way, but the 4 well-beings are always at the forefront of our policy making. And so when we work through the Section 32 analysis, we're always looking at putting forward the best options that are the most appropriate, that are going to achieve what we want. And so take your point that this is not just about the people that have a formal agreement with council, but be more all-encompassing. And I think that the district plan is for everybody in Kaipara. So I think with that at the forefront of your mind when we're talking about tangata whenua, you know, everybody has a story and an affiliation of some description, and some more than others. So we'll be talking about the people that have Māori land. We'll be talking about the people who live on properties where they might have a site of significance to Māori. And so so those people won't always be what you'd term to be part of the relationship agreement, but they're certainly affected people. So we need to be thinking about everybody in a holistic context for this district plan review. Does that help answer the question, or have I just side skirted it?
That was
getting the
excellent. Thank you. I really appreciate that answer.
Okay, cool. Any other questions, and I'll move on to Directive 5.
Bring on, please. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so Directive 5 there on the slide there is the list of hapu and iwi documents. Have I already covered this? Sorry, just a quick read.
Yes.
Yep,
Yes.
sorry. Okay, next one. Right, Directive 6. So this is consultation chapter. So this is where we need specific consultation processes with tangata whenua as required by the RMA mapped out. And so sometimes it's really good to be clear on what those steps are. And I know from talking to our consents team that they would like some more helpful tools in their toolbox to point people to the consultation process and what is required. So that's something that we will definitely be looking at and working with the consents team to refine, and obviously with our partners in terms of their input. And like I said, they're busy all the time with cultural impact assessments and input into resource consents. So it is important that we get that right. So we've got, in that space would be obviously writing out our best practice for consultation and engagement processes as agreed with specific iwi or hapu. And this is where the flowchart is also a great way of just being really clear visually about how we do that. And so I've seen that in a few district plans, and I think would probably like to bring an example of that back to you when we bring the chapter. And then obviously links and references to best practice, external best practice documents, an explanation of the purpose of any consultation process. And I think that kind of alludes to what Fiona was talking about earlier with providing an explanation of what is required and why is it required, so that people understand the purpose of it and how it feeds into a resource consent process, for example. And then reference to how the consultation processes are given effect to. So consultation is one of the more important functions of the district plan, and so we want to make sure that working collaboratively with our iwi partners, they're comfortable that we've set what I term an appropriate level of engagement, and that it's meaningful engagement, because a lot of older district plans kind of have some loose text about sort of almost a token gesture, like, oh yep, you should or it might consult with iwi. But I think in some situations we'd like that to be a bit more meaningful and actually engage appropriately when the situation lends itself to formal consultation, as opposed to an FYI, or you might be interested in this proposal, for example. So does anyone have any questions on the consultation chapter before I launch into the next part of my presentation?
Sorry, I do have another question through the
Your
worship. Sorry. Hey, for us as your partner as such, we would like to try and start standardizing what that looks like, so it's real clear for yourselves and the planners, and also for applicants when they come in, that we standardize what and why at the forefront. Is that something that would sit, so to respect that it's just Uri or Ho's perspective and it's not all the perspectives of other hapu, mana whenua and tangata whenua, where would that sit? Could that potentially sit inside the district plan, or is that another tool that can sit outside of?
Yeah, so in response to that, I'd like to think that it can, and I'd like to think that the other iwi partners would value, and hapu groups would value the same, in terms of their processes. So if you each have sort of slightly different processes, I think that's fine. What we need to be clear on in the district plan, and the great thing about electronic plans is that you can attach documents and open them, and so it's really easily accessible and there. But if we can standardise it across all iwi authorities and hapu groups that can agree collectively that this is the process and these are the steps and this is how we want it to go, I mean, that makes the job so much easier from a council perspective, you know, because we're doing it the same way for everybody, and there's not different steps. So I think the answer is yes, and I think that we should continue that conversation and see how we can best pull what we can into the district plan. Any other questions on consultation? All right, I'll move on. So I'm now going to talk you through the current district plan. So I just wanted to demonstrate what's in our plan at the moment to show you how we're trying to move forward in a more positive way. So I won't read out the 5.5 tangata whenua objectives there, but I just wanted to tell you what is wrong with these objectives, and remembering that they were written quite a long time ago now. If our plan was deemed operative in 2013, drafting of those probably happened a few years earlier as they were working through their plan. So things were a little bit different back then. And so I've made the comment before that I don't think these are very meaningful to tangata whenua, mana whenua relationships, and I don't think that they recognise the values and the Te Ao Māori worldview perspective. So I think these are very redundant tangata whenua objectives. I don't think they capture the relationship that Kaipara District Council has with its tangata whenua partners, and I think that we need to up our game here. So I certainly wouldn't want to be, you know, advocating to roll these over. And I just don't think that they recognise the current management plans or the IMPs or the values within each of these documents. And then, as I've just talked about in terms of consultation, I don't think that they ensure meaningful consultation where required and appropriate. So those are my kind of key 4 points about what's wrong with the tangata whenua objectives there. I don't think I'm kind of on the wrong track, but if anyone's got any comments on those before I move off, because I'm going to move into our way forward. Not seeing any hands up, so I'll just launch into the next part. So what Virginia and I have been working on for the last couple of weeks in preparation for today, and you'll have a document there that just sets out the issue statements and our proposed objectives. Now remember, these are just draft, and these, just to reiterate in case someone missed the slide that Paul had, these will slide into our strategic direction tangata whenua section of the plan. So they kind of act as, I like to call it, an umbrella. So everything at the top of the umbrella is in these objectives, and then we get more detailed and more specific, as I mentioned, the cascading with policies and then the rules. And so these are very high level objectives that talk across the plan, and then we get more specific later on. So so the best way that we could figure out how to write these, you know, thinking in a new context was to map out what the issues were. So the first issue that we've got there, and apologies for the typo, is ensure that authorities receive appropriate recognition of the district plan and that their legislative status is acknowledged. And so we drafted the wording, recognise and provide for the partnership with iwi authorities within Kaipara, Hapu and mana whenua by incorporating the Te Ao Māori approach to enhance the protection of Te Taio and the natural environment. And that's actually the wording that does come through in the new MBA. So we thought we'd pick up on that, kind of knowing that that's sort of the direction that we're heading. So does anyone have any questions or comments on that one? Or I'll keep moving through them and we can have a conversation.
I do.
Yep.
Why would you not give effect to the partnership?
That's a good question. I think where recognition was kind of the wording that I had, because recognition does account for give effect to in my mind, but you know, happy to wordsmith. This was just to test the water. I can see Councillor Vincent. Have you got a question there?
if I could just take the second one first, the issue statement, like it sets out what a problem is, and then the next bullet point points a way forward to solving it. Whereas with the first issue statement, it's not actually stating a problem. It's kind of setting out what the objective is of the that the next bit will achieve. So I just wonder if the first issue statement was more worded along the lines of iwi authorities are not receiving appropriate recognition in the district plan, and then you've got the solution to that problem with the next bit that follows for it to
Yes,
be internally consistent.
certainly. Yep. Remember, the issue statements don't fall into the plan either. This is just to help frame up our objectives and trying to set the issue. But I totally take your point on that, and I think that's a good suggestion there. Fiona, have you got a question there? I can see your hand.
Yeah, sorry. Can you just socialise through me why the wording iwi authorities are used? After we've just had the discussion around tangata whenua, mana whenua, because iwi authorities is in a status that a lot of tangata whenua have.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, well, the intention is to try and capture everybody, and so I think we probably put that in thinking, well, it's clear that iwi authorities within Kaipara, hapu and mana whenua by incorporating the te ao, so I guess we were thinking that if we acknowledge the iwi authorities in the objective and that partnership, so in my mind that was about recognising the partnership that we have with the iwi authorities given their legal status, but also everybody else. So
just remember that this is a first cut working draft of this as well. It isn't a final product, and we haven't socialised it with our mana whenua partners either yet. So just remember that this is a first cut draft of how things could look like, as opposed to a finished product. And we're happy to take feedback, happy to work things through with all partners.
So yeah, so your tangata whenua such as Kapehu Marae are excluded from this.
we probably need tangata whenua specifically in there as well then, yes?
Yes, I agree with that.
To capture everybody.
If you've got iwi authorities and tangata whenua, that might, because iwi authorities is mana whenua, that might capture it quite nicely, but that was just my view.
Yeah, no, that's really valuable, and I do apologise, Fiona, because we've put you on the spot today, but we wanted to have something to test with the elected members. So grateful for your contributions, and this is definitely, as Mike said, a work in progress. So definitely not finalised.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that, but it's a really good space to give feedback so everybody can hear the whakaaro behind it. So I really appreciate being here.
My question is about the use of the issue statement as a prompt for shaping this plan, and I think it's wonderful. And is wondering, is that something that's just specific to only for the tangata whenua chapter, or are you going to use that tool for shaping the district plan and identifying issues elsewhere?
Yeah, so remembering that the issue statements don't need to go into a district plan, and a lot of plans don't include them now, but probably my plan drafting skills go back to the old days of drafting an issue statement first and then your objective. And I just personally find it really helpful to frame up the problem that you're trying to solve, and then writing your objectives and policies to frame up how you're going to achieve those outcomes, as we talked about in our plan drafting principles. So I guess take on board that you like that. Paul may not like to write like that. I don't think he's included any issue statements in his there, but we can definitely take that point on board and work to be consistent if you like that approach. But for today, this was probably my own personal style of drafting, bringing the detail to you. So, and wanted to frame the issues up first so you could understand what it was I was trying to achieve through the objective.
Thank you. And so please take into account what Councillor Vincent said earlier about actually having the first one actually as an issue rather than just already a solution, if you like, an issue to be addressed. Michael, you flew your flag,
Yes.
flag there, and then Councillor Vincent, your hand is still up.
Thank you, Your Worship. So just to clarify, it's likely that our Section 32 reports will each have one or more issue statements to help the team frame up their provisions, but we have to actually have in the front of our mind at all times what is adding value to the district plan, and having issues in the district plan per se may not be adding value to the district plan itself. So we have to be cognizant of that, but just to clarify, our Section 32 reports will have issues in them which will help frame up the objectives and the policies and how we flow through those. That's all.
Yep, good point, yeah.
Councillor Vincent, hand is still up. No? All right, okay, thank you. I've got a question we're still in statement number 1 here and your solution here. A district plan is about more than protection. It's the whole set of development guidelines for the entire place. So your first statement goes along broadly and then goes very narrow and talks only about the protection of the environment, not about rules for development or where we are going to in a development direction. Yeah. In all of the 4 well-beings, it actually then only talks about one of the well-beings.
Yes.
So because your issue statement number 1 as written is actually already its own solution, and then your bullet points there, recognise and provide for the partnership, is just the way that would be achieved. Yeah, but then you go down a rabbit hole here of talking only about one of the 4 well-beings, and that I'm not sure that Te Ao Māori approach is only about one of the 4 well-beings, but that's not for me to comment on. But I'm just going, where's this going to? Yeah, is it only about protection? And again, we talked about protection as against preservation and protection measures, but all of the well-beings here. Is there any further commentary on that?
Yeah, no,
through the chair, if we look at, sorry, Catherine, just bear in mind that this is one of 5 objectives that we've got so far for Tangata Whenua, Mana Whenua, and if we go quickly, Catherine, to the next slide, objective 5, you'll see that does touch on the 4 well-beings that the Mayor's just spoken to there. So the first one is one of several objectives in this space that we've got so far.
Sorry, yes, okay, thank you. And I see, and we'll get to that in a moment, but statement number 5 is about Māori land alone, separately, but I'm understanding here statement number 1, and where this is going to is across the entire Kaipara district space, not limited to Māori land.
Yep, that's right. I think I would like to have another crack at just bringing in the 4 well-beings here as well, just to really give it that umbrella approach that I talked about before, because you're right, it's not just about protection of the natural environment here. It is about, so I guess the key message of this is recognizing the partnership and the relationships that we have across Kaipara. And the second part to that is by incorporating a Te Ao Māori approach. And so we could frame that up certainly to bring in, you know, enhancing the full well-beings or something to that effect. Because I feel like you're right, it is quite narrow. So really
Yeah.
great feedback. Thank you.
Good feedback. Yep.
There are 3 parts in that long sentence. Yeah.
Yep.
And you could stop at, as it's currently written, you could stop at mana whenua, the words mana whenua, and it still makes perfect sense.
Yeah, I think that.
Do you see what I'm saying? So
Yeah,
that's
I
part
do.
1, and then you've got part 2 is by incorporating a Te Ao Māori approach. Okay, is part 2 of that is what, and then why is to enhance the protection. So it's the 3rd part. Now, for all of the elected members here, those 3 parts each require consideration. And then the collective whole of that. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to make it really meaningful so that when you're in a consent hearing and you might be talking about something that directly affects iwi, and you can point to this one and say, you know, this is the one that establishes the relationship and why it's important and what we're trying to achieve as a district. So this one, I think it needs to frame that up. So happy to have another tackle at that. And
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Ty, for your written
Good
comment in
feedback.
the chat there. And Councillor De Lavaris has a question here.
Yes, thank you. Once again, my contribution here is to counter the discussion with that has just proceeded with offering another opinion. So I can see, I've got here in my notebook my notes from reading the Randerson report, and the new Act will have explicitly in its purpose Te mana o te tai ao, and safeguarding you know, the essential relationship between the health of the environment and the resources the environment produces and their capacity to sustain life. I think it's entirely appropriate.
Excuse me, Councillor De Lavaris Woodcock. Look, I'm going to stop you here. We've already addressed the fact that we cannot know what is going to be in the legislation. You're reading the Randerson report, okay, which is not the legislation. We cannot yet know what is in, will be in proposed legislation. And so it would be madness for us to be going too far at this point into trying to imagine what will be in that legislation. All right. So
thank you, Mr. Mayor, for overriding me. But if I can conclude my statement.
Sorry.
I would like to conclude my statement, Mr. Mayor, that I believe that we need to keep the environment at the forefront of the discussion and not push it behind other objectives. And that is my point. And thank you for allowing me to make that. Thank you.
Okay.
I will now
thank you.
turn off my microphone.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. Look, I remind elected members not to get too far ahead of ourselves regarding what legislation may or may not yet come. Principles of whether the environment is more important than the people are up to each elected member. But the important thing here for everybody is not to get ahead of ourselves. Okay, we cross those bridges as we come to them in the future as a council. So thank you. We'll go back to Catherine to continue with this piece. Thank you.
Okay, so next issue statement. You've probably all jumped ahead and had a read of that, but so this one's about the iwi management plans not being implemented appropriately. And this one, we also wanted to recognise the role of kaitiaki, which we think is important and sometimes isn't being acknowledged or provided for in the district plan. So I guess the key issue there is that we want to make sure those values that are identified in the IMPs are implemented in the plan, and that we also recognise the relationship with kaitiaki and their role. So the next wording there, ensure the values identified in iwi management plans are considered, and that the mātauranga knowledge of kaitiaki, which is guardian stewards, is respected when considering the synergies, and that was the best word we could come up with, between the natural environment and people. So how that interconnectedness kind of works there with their role in facilitating, you know, some really great work on the ground when it comes to resource consents and resource management issues. So any questions and comments, feedback on that one?
So I have a point again. It would be good to use consistent languages, such as recognize and provide for, you know, rather than ensure the values, you know.
Yep, that's fine. I just didn't want it to sound a little bit repetitive. So, and ensure as you know, ensure. So that it makes sure that we put it into the plan. So.
But that's but again, if we've outlined at the beginning what the hierarchy is that's being talked to here,
yep,
then it would be good to use the same hierarchy. Yeah.
Yep. Yep. Anything else on issue statement number 2 or objective number 2, or I'll move on.
Through your worship, I just made a little comment. If this is explicitly the words, potentially could we remove the translated? So te taiao is put as natural environment, but to Māori that's actually quite a bigger definition. And just mātauranga, take out knowledge and of kaitiaki guardianships and steward. Is that possible, or can we put a glossary at the back?
Yeah, I think, Fiona, we will have a glossary, and I guess that was something that we hadn't sort of talked about, the terminology and where that lives. Well, it will live in the plan, but I guess just in terms of presenting this, I wanted to be clear about what those terms meant, but totally take on your point to take it out, so we can definitely do that.
You can go to the next one, Catherine.
All right. So issue statement number 3. So this is about the cultural values and traditions of tangata whenua not being recognised and provided for in a meaningful and appropriate way. So this kind of speaks to things like traditional activities and things as recognised in the RMA. So that's where the wording in fact comes from here. So recognise and provide for the cultural values and traditions associated with ancestral land, water, sites of significance, wahi tapu and taonga. That's all from the RMA, and ensure meaningful consultation where appropriate. So I've put the where appropriate as a bit of a flexibility, if you like, to not make it a mandatory requirement, or that we can apply some you know, criteria around certainly the consultation section we talked about earlier, when it's appropriate versus when it's not, or when, you know, you might want to find out if it is or isn't. So that's where the where appropriate comes in.
So I have a question, Catherine. So the use of the words ancestral land, does this talk to, and I'll pick up point 5 coming later, does this talk to Māori land in the sense of how that is legally defined, or is this all land across the landscape? What is ancestral land in this context of the place of Kaipara district?
So the ancestral land term comes directly from the Resource Management Act, and if I'm honest, I'd probably just need to check whether it's a defined term or not, Your Worship, because when we put this in the wording we were thinking in the context. So when we think about ancestral land, there's obviously people that affiliate with land but may not necessarily own it, but have interest or you know, requirements that do require consultation, for example. But to answer your question about the term, I'd have to probably ask Paul or Mike, have you got the Resource Management Act definition to hand there? Sorry, I can't move with my screens during the presentation here.
So ancestral land, is it part 2? Let's have a look. I can get
Yeah,
there
just
now if you want.
that would be
Possibly
helpful.
keep talking through if anyone else has any other questions, and I can double
It's
check.
not in section 2.
Not in
Okay,
section
no.
2.
In that case, no.
Okay, and so the other place that I would probably look is whether there's been any definition in terms of case law to say, you know, how that applies, where it applies.
Virginia has added here, Catherine, that there is no definition. So
it's that terminology is straight out of the legislation, and if they don't define it, then it's a subjective interpretation, which usually if there's been cases about it, you might find the interpretation through case law. But I guess our thinking, like I mentioned, is quite a wider context to ancestral land, not just Māori owned land, because the district plan needs to obviously provide for Māori land, but also there's a lot of people in our district that affiliate with land that they don't necessarily own. So I mean, Virginia, you might want to chip in here because we had quite a detailed conversation about ancestral land and how that kind of works across
so for me, when I look at ancestral land, what I'm thinking about are access ways to Mahinga Kai, which was you know, where we used to gather food. It could be like watercress and drains. We've seen it throughout Kaipara. Whānau still going back to those same drains on other people's lands. Ancestral land, it actually incorporates a lot. It could be treaty settlement land, part of those lands. For myself personally, it's our papakainga that we've never lost ahika over. So it does, for me, it goes across the district. But again, until we have a look at the what common law says and how they've gone and defined it, we'll probably set the tone for how it comes out in our district plan, to be fair, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you.
Thank
you. That is helpful.
Your worship, as well, as a point of clarification, and under the RMA, section 6, a matter of national importance, section 6E is the relationship of Māori and their culture and traditions with their ancestral lands, water, sites, wāhi tapu, and other taonga. So that is where ancestral lands comes in as a matter of national importance as well.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, can I just maybe make a comment that through our policies or other provisions too, we might be able to flesh out, you know, what we mean, set it at a higher objective level, and then be more specific as we move into some of the policies. Now, remember, these are strategic directions, but there will be other chapters that we can draft some policy in this space to talk about what we mean there, so we can provide some context.
Thank you, Catherine.
Okay, so we move on to issue statement number 4. This is about the identification and protection of sites and areas of sites and areas to tangata whenua being needed in the district plan. So while we'll probably touch on this in the historical heritage chapter, I thought the strategic direction was a good place to signal our protection, identification and protection of these sites. So this is quite a simple, straightforward objective that just talks specifically to identifying and protecting sites and areas of significance to Māori, where these are at risk of being directly impacted or permanently lost. So We probably will dive into this discussion in a lot more detail when we bring that work to you, I believe early next year. But if anyone's got any sort of comments from that strategic level at this point, be happy for any feedback. I can see Fiona's hand up, or is...
Sorry, just really quickly, does it have to be at risk? Can it be protecting sites of significance where these are at risk? Is that preempting development, or is that just us being able to establish those sites and say, well, these are the ones that we want to preserve, like the word preserve? Yeah, it's just probably more cordial just on that are potentially at risk or are at risk. How are we classifying?
Yeah, it's
risk?
quite a loose interpretation on reflection, Fiona. Because if you're talking about those at risk, you know, you'd say that the criteria for that is that it would be at risk versus potentially at risk, and you know, how does that feed into consultation on these as well? So yeah, I think let's have some more discussion about that wording in particular, but great point, and I've made a note of it, so thank you. Anybody else on that one?
So I have a question again. It's a question of scale. And what, when you say identify and protect, again, it's like, what are those protection rules? But the scale, which is how much of Kaipara district, if the district plan is a development, the development rules, in with such a potential discussion as this, where could this end up going to, and what analysis has been done about that? What kinds of areas, sites and areas of significance are we talking about, are being potentially talked about here? Because if this is not Māori owned land, customary land, ancestral land, but other sites that are currently, you know, owned by someone and in the middle of a farm somewhere and so on, are those potential sites all going to be mapped? What is the scale of all of this as a piece of work? Sorry, if you like, yeah. This could be an enormous. I mean, it's very rich, but it's potentially enormous in the district plan. I don't get the what's the word that I'm going to use the word again, the hierarchical depth of this, and also the spread across the district. You know, yeah.
So through you, Your Worship, we haven't really kicked off that work yet, but we are due to bring it back to the February 2022 council briefing to discuss these sites and areas of significance to tangata whenua, and we will be working through that over the coming months with our iwi partners as we go through that exercise. But take your point, yes, it has potential to actually be quite far-reaching and ranging far and wide, and I suppose it would come down to what we end up defining to be a site or area of significance, and so there's a few steps to cross there. We aren't there yet. Is the short answer. That space. Not really sure if that helps or not.
Okay, thank you. But yes, yeah, there are many aspects here. and noting in our spatial plan work, there were significant sites identified. Significant sites for tangata whenua. And so you go, interesting. And potentially very, very complex about what the rules become for those places.
Yep.
And how everything gets identified. Very interesting.
It is interesting, and on one hand, that's one of the benefits of actually producing a draft plan first. So we actually try and do this work up front, and then actually put a draft plan out and say, hey, public, what do you think about this? Please give us feedback. And we do all this process prior to actually starting the formal Schedule 1 public notification process. So yes, it's going to be slightly challenging, but it'll be an interesting process we work through. And again, yeah, that's the benefit of having multiple touch points with the community as opposed to going straight to a public notification process.
Yeah, so again, matters of definition here. I would say if there's direction from me here, please be as clear in this as you can possibly be for the avoidance of doubt, because this will be of real interest to people. Fiona, your hand is up. Kia ora. Hand is now down. Yep, hand is down. All right, thank you. I'm watching the clock, team. It's after 1 o'clock, and we're nearly at the end of this this section. Thank you.
Yes, I think our next slide is our last slide, actually, Your Worship.
That's right.
We're just about
Yep.
there.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, that is the last slide. So this objective and issue statement is really a lead into the work that we'll be doing on the Maori Purpose Zone chapter, and talking specifically to the development of Māori land. So whether we've framed the issue quite right, but what we were trying to get at here was that there are so many constraints with the development of Māori land at the moment, and these are not being realised in district plans, and some of those include obviously legislative mechanisms as well, which some are within the RMA and some are within the Maori Land Court jurisdiction. So what we're putting forward here is just, and I've used the term enable here because we actually want to kind of enable or promote Maori land to be developed to provide for those four well-beings which we talked about earlier, and the community. So not just the land directly, but those spin-off effects from development to those communities where Maori land is situated. So really keen for your views on this one, and this one will obviously lead into some of our policies and provisions around papakainga development, activities that can enable some economic development within the Maori blocks. And so when we bring that chapter to you, we'll show you where the blocks are. Most are rural zoned at the moment, or in rural environments. So the sort of intention here is that we're being enabling, and I guess not just focused on Maori land as in Maori freehold title, but also enabling Māori to develop land that they own. It could be papakainga in, say, a residential context, or in another zone that we haven't thought about. So we'll be bringing those options to you when we talk about papakainga and Māori development. But this is just setting the high level scene to make sure we're providing that umbrella objective to make sure we're looking after those four well-beings from a Māori perspective in the community. So I see Fiona's hand up there. Do you want to lead in, Fiona?
Kia ora, thank you. I'm really glad to see this statement right up front of the strategic direction. As we move through other legislation, Māori always want to develop their land, but we've got constraints around Te Whenua Māori Act. but at least this provision here gives that ability for us to do that from a land use perspective. You know, Māori land will never be alienated. It will still maintain. We don't subdivide. Subdivision is something that the courts prefer not to do. So, you know, the density and the conversations that happened around having lifestyle blocks, well, we've got a permanent Māori land block that will probably stay at 50 hectare plus. But I'm happy with this provision because, for say, if we go down the track of the Three Waters reform, it will give us the ability to look at what that could look like in a rural space and being able to develop Māori land there in terms of our own infrastructure in a rural space. So yeah, no, I'm happy to see this one here. That's my only comment.
Oh, thank you, Fiona. Anybody else got any questions, comments?
Yeah, I've got a comment. It's a bit challenging regarding the legislative mechanisms over which we have zero control. So yeah, so this needs to be addressed because your issue talks about things that Kaipara District Council can't actually have any control over. So I don't know how to address that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Yeah,
that wasn't
so,
intention
yeah,
of the issue statement. Yeah.
It's kind of little council, stay in your lane, you know.
Yeah. No, this is more about recognising those
Yeah.
issues, Your Worship, and obviously they are out of our control, but recognising that they're there and the constraints, because a lot of district plans don't think about those constraints sometimes. So we just wanted to recognise that as an issue for our plan, and are working with our mana whenua through what it will look like for them to develop. And I'm really excited about the space for them and for us as KDC. So yeah, I think this is a really great lead in to that work.
Thank you. And Virginia, you've joined us by video and your hand is up there. Kia ora.
I just want to make a quick just a statement about this one. The thing is that the law changes with the Tori Mana Whenua Act, Trustees Act, they've been starting to move as a whole collective to actually enable and empower this. We've got Kāinga order homes and things like this that are all TPK is starting to ramp up. So for us as a district council, yeah, there is a lot of things that are out of our control, but let's make sure that when they all line up, that our district plan is ready to take them and we can move. So yeah, so I was really happy about this. So that was just in comment of we know, but this statement here also enables us to recognise that those constraints are outside of our district plan and outside of our powers. But the point for me is to have it ready, let's go, so that when these all those other things come into play, we're ready. Kia ora.
Thank you. Councillor Wills.
Yeah, thanks. Just a question. What's the definition of Maori land in this particular case?
Yep. So so Maori land in this particular case could be, well, we actually haven't said like Māori owned land specifically. So I mentioned before that some of the provisions here could extend to different tenures of property. So we all know Māori freehold land is one of those tenures, which will be the focus of the Māori purpose zone. But Māori may own land in a residential context, commercial, industrial, across the district. So I'm really saying here that we want to enable Maori land to be developed to provide for their cultural, economic, social environment.
Sorry.
I'm sorry. I'll keep going, Mr. Mayor, with my question. Thank you.
No, I was just going to say on your behalf, Councillor Wills, Catherine, can we please have a definition of what that Maori land is? Is it land owned by Maori, or is it Maori customary land? It's how far down does that go?
Yes, no, I take your point.
Answer
It's a
kind
bit
of
confusing.
indicated that it was any land that's owned by a person who identifies as Maori. Is that what this you're wanting this to be.
Well, remember that the tangata whenua, what we've just talked about in the holistic context is tangata whenua, so the people of Kaipara, that are considered tangata whenua, and that could be anybody really. And what I think our district plan needs to focus on is definitely the Maori purpose zone, which we will probably narrowly focus to Maori freehold titles and customary titles, and there'll be some clear definitions around what falls into the zoning. But my intention with this being a strategic objective is it's Maori land, as in, it could be just general freehold title, and there's a whole bunch of technicalities and complexities which we will probably give you some more detail on when we get to talking about Maori land. But a lot of land was converted to general title back in the 60s and 70s, and so for all intents and purposes it's the same as everybody else's land, but Māori still own it, and so we don't want to disadvantage them just by saying, oh, it has to be, this is just about Māori title. It needs to be a bit more encompassing than that. So my intention is that this talks to Māori land, as in it could be general, it's not talking specifically to tenure, but when we get to the policy level and the rule level, we will be narrowly focusing that in terms of the zoning versus, and we'll talk you through some options that we've been looking at for Papakainga, which might enable development on general title, but it's for the benefit of Māori and their cultural, economic, social well-being. So I don't want to disadvantage by just saying this is just about Māori freehold title or Māori owned land, if that makes sense.
Sorry, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Sorry, can I finish my question, please, Mr. Mayor?
Yes, absolutely. Councillor Wills, back to you. Thank you.
First of all, I'd like to say thank you to the Mayor for trying to save me by saying something I might not be appreciated. I'm raising a concern as a councillor that definition needs to be tightened up, because if there's any suggestion that by identifying as a Maori you have different land use rights than somebody that doesn't, I'm going to challenge that quite strongly, and this is where I'm giving direction as a councillor. But I also totally support the necessity to encourage the development of the Papakainga and other underutilised Maori land. But my direction to you as a staff member, as a councillor, is to be very careful not to come out with two parallel sets of rules for our ratepayers in the Kaipara district. So I'm asking you, I identify as a Maori, and so do my children, but does that mean I should have rights that the person next door to me doesn't have? So please take that on board with this. At the moment, it's so generically huge, it potentially gives us a parallel operation within our district. And I do support what you're trying to achieve. I'm just asking you to narrow down how you perceive that definition of Maori land, please.
Certainly, Councillor Wills. We'll have a look at the way in which we've worded that objective to try and provide clarity, if that's helpful.
Thank you, Councillor Wills, for making that clear, and Catherine, thank you for the longer discussion, which has illuminated more into where the policy team was looking at heading the direction of this piece of the work. So thank you for that. There may be other comments from elected members in this space.
Thank you, Your Worship. That is the end of our presentation for today.
All right. Okay, so thank you, Michael, and thank you, Catherine, and thank you, Paul, for your presentations today. This has been a very interesting briefing, and I'd also like to thank our guests as well, Fiona and Katarina, for joining us this afternoon on this item. At this point, there being no further items for the discussion, I suggest that we close down our briefing for today, and then everyone can go and get on. Thank you for your patience regarding holding back from going to lunch. So it's now 1:20 p.m. So I'm going to close with a karakia at this point, after which, Tracy, you'll be able to stop the live recording and the broadcast. Thank you. And I'd also, just before closing here, I'd like to thank all of the staff again, thank the viewing public, to apologise for some potentially robust conversations that you hear around the Zoom hui that we've had. We are accustomed to working in a room together, and of course the disciplines regarding working in a digital environment are very different for us, and it's sometimes the sound may have been inaudible as people were talking over each other, so I apologize for that. In any case, thank you for joining us today, and I'm about to close with a karakia. Kia tau nā manakitanga a te mea ngā rau, ki runga ki teina a tātou, kia mahia te hua makihikihi, kia toi te kupu, toi te mana, toi te aroha, toi te reo Māori, tihe Māori ora.
Ori ora.
Muri ora.
Kia ora.
Muri ora.
Kia pai tora, have a good day. Kia pai tora.
Kia pai tora.